Hello, Zvi.
Hello,
The
Robin.
Zvi.
Yeah,
Actually, you are the Zvi, right? Not
yeah.
just
No,
Zvi.
that started from a poker site. It just never stopped. So
Okay. What do the other Zvis mind? Have they objected?
I, there can be only one.
I see. Nobody's even bothered to object.
Occasionally, one comes along, and I go, "Oh, that's kind of cool," but I'm still.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, I've been doing a number of conversations with people on this topic just because it's fun to talk in depth on something, and there's a lot of interesting depth here. And the topic is AI risk, and you apparently just wrote an op-ed or released an op-ed today on the topic.
Yeah, that was my first attempt to communicate it to like a person on the street who like isn't versed in these questions, doesn't even know about
Right.
all these systems that we just experience every day for mundane utility purposes, and to try and boil it down, because it's a very different experience writing for a newspaper.
Yes, it is.
Right?
It is, in fact.
You get 700 words, and then normally I will write something like 50 times that.
Right.
So
yeah, you do these long posts, which many people love. So I want to propose a framing. So obviously you can just reject my framing or disagree with it or whatever. So don't feel too pressured by it. But when I want to offer a framing for the discussion, my framing is to start with, what did we think was going to happen without AI? In terms of, humanity's been changing a lot over the millennia. We plausibly would continue to change a lot into the future. That would, go on for a long time, million, billion, who knows how long. And we would change a lot, plausibly. And you could either think that those change would be limited in some important way or unlimited. And you could like it or dislike it, but you might like it if it was slow, but dislike it if it was fast. You might care about how fast that sort of change happens. And then you might, if you disliked it, maybe would want to stop change or be very selective about change. And then we could ask, how does AI change the story? That is, if AIs, appear and then evolve and change, do they go somewhere different than humans would go? Do they go there faster? Is there more possibility of conflict, or is it the same level of conflict? That's the kind of framing I might ask, is because I fear or suspect that a lot of AI concerns are really just generic concerns about where change could go. So I thought I'd offer that as a framing for, where.
Right. So as background, I don't know how many of our listeners will also have done so, but I listened to your conversation of Katja Grace.
Okay.
And I found that very interesting. And, it raised a lot of these issues. And, I definitely am eager to go explore them in more ways that, take positions that she didn't necessarily quite take herself. I have some perspective. So yeah, I think this is the most interesting kind of discussion that we can have. I think getting into the technicals of what exactly is going to happen when, right, like under what scenario, it's not as interesting for us. It's not the right, not the right subject. So yeah, I think that, there's a very big difference or series of differences between the kinds of change and the kinds of outcomes I would expect in an AI world versus a world without AIs. And so when I say without AIs, right, I'm imagining not that we tear down what we already have, right? Or that we don't develop computers that can do anything that they can already have, but that, I'm imagining a world like an AI fiddles type of world where the AI abilities plateau and they're tools that help us perform certain tasks better.
Right.
But you would never talk about them having rights or owning property or, anything like that.
So in that hypothetical, now we're focused on the humans not the AIs, right? We're saying, but I presume you agree that humans have been changing substantially over a millennia, and that they probably would continue to do so.
No, I do think we have interesting disagreements about how humans have changed and about how humans from the past would view the changes we've already had. So, as I understand the way you look at it, right, you would say that, well, if you look at humans well into the past and they look at today's world, that they would say, oh, today's world is quite bad because of all of these changes of various ways. The things that I value are not so valued. There isn't that much of them. And this is bad. And I certainly think for some humans of the past, they would say that, especially some very religious humans, right, who had very specific beliefs about exactly what must be true and everything else, like basically that enshrined that any change would be bad, right? Like almost literally any change would be bad. And I do think that, like, when you look at the broad range of theoretically possible rearrangements of atoms, any possible change you could make, then most changes are in fact bad in that sense, right? Like that, the local ordering of the Earth is like a 99th percentile good ordering compared to all of the orderings of matter, certainly preferred to Mars or Jupiter or Alpha Centauri or a number of other similar places. And so I have some sympathy. But I think that, like, if you took, the average ancient Greek, right, or the average person, living in, ancient Egypt, or the average, Indian or Chinese person from thousands of years ago, and you brought them into today's world, there'd be a lot of shock, right? Initially, they'd be like, what's going on? What are these cars? What are these machines? Why are there so many people? What are all of these weird clothes people were wearing? What are these languages people were talking, blah, blah, blah. But that if you gave them, some time to acclimate, you had them a chance to, like, understand what was happening to them, and you had a translator to help them through it, and like a guide, and so they didn't just, and so on, that they would see a lot of good in the changes that we've made and a lot of value in the things that we do. And that, they might in the end want to say, can I now go home to my village, right? And do the things that I'm used to doing because I'm a creature of habit. But they wouldn't, for the most part, I think in the absence of strong specific religious beliefs, I think they would say that there's a lot of good about our world and that our world has a lot of value, and that they wouldn't feel like the changes had just been bad.
So could we separate out sort of wealth increases, capacity, ability increases from value changes or even attitude changes? So, I think we might agree that if people saw the wealth as something they could take control of and use for their purposes, then they might generally approve of increases in capacity. And so if you showed them, hey, instead of your donkey, you could use this car, then they might, if they understood that, for the same cost, they could do more, they might approve of that. So the usual complaint about, say, AI values changing is not a complaint about the AI's capacities increasing. People separate those two, but they are concerned about the value changes. And when people are concerned about generational changes, they tend to be concerned more specifically about those attitude and value changes relative to capacities.
Right. And when we talk about AI change, right, I envision most people thinking about a package where we get all of these additional economic resources, right, and capacity gains. And in exchange for that, there are these other changes, which, I think we characterize pretty differently, but we'll hold that discussion until we get there. And then the question is, well, if you think that the capacity changes, everyone mostly thinks there's good. And then the question is, are there value changes that are those good? Are those neutral? Or are they a little bit bad, but not as bad as the capacity changes are good? Or are they so bad that, like, I would give up the capacity changes to stop these changes in values if I had that choice? And then, again, like when we look about people from the past, I think, they would be very happy that, people live longer, that they have less disease, that they have more economic resources of various types, right? These things would, they live in nicer houses, and they have, better food and so on and so on. And they would definitely approve of all of these things. And then in terms of the actual, just looking at the values themselves, I think that's actually a pretty mixed bag. Like when I think about, like, just concretely, what are my values when I look out at the world and how it's changed in 2023 versus the world of like 1993, like when I was like old enough to understand what was going on around me in a serious way, there has been a substantial amount of values change in these past 30 years. And I would say that most of it was towards things that I didn't believe in 1993, because in 1993 I was young and I mostly believed the things that people around me were telling me to believe. And I would say that, some of those changes I think are bad, but the majority of those changes I endorse now looking back. But I also think that if the person of me in 1993, if you presented those changes, I mean, you kind of did, right? You got the chance to experience those changes and see what they were and reach a decision. yeah, I see them as like largely good. And like, I think that there's been a lot of changes that like, I feel like most people in the past would endorse if they had social permission to endorse them, if they felt like the norms around them were allowing them to endorse those changes. Right. So like like obvious dramatic examples of improved, of what I would think would be improved values from things like slavery. Right. Where like, maybe 2000 years ago, most people lived in places that where there were slaves. And mostly because people around them said that slaves were okay and came up with reasons why they thought slaves were okay, everyone like expressed that slaves were okay and like came up with stories they told themselves or why it was okay for people to own other people. And in the moment when someone proposes let's free the slaves, everyone comes up with reasons why it would be a bad idea. But I think if you transported them to a world in which we didn't have that, right, or at least where it was like carried on in an illegal fashion in places that were relatively lawless or whatever, that people would not say, well, my traditions involve this, or like if you explain why the economics didn't require it anymore, right, like why people would be fine without it, I think they would adjust their values and they would think this change was good. And I'm not saying that obviously I've not picked a random change out of all of the changes that have happened in the last 10,000 or 2,000 years, but I also think that like what are the big changes, right, from like ancient Greece to now in terms of what we value, and why would someone necessarily disapprove of them, like on reflection? Because like there's a certain thing where like someone will say, well, how about we make this change, right? Like, and then people say, oh no, that's change. That change is bad. I don't like change. I don't know what that would do. But then you introduce the change, and then 10, 20 years later, or a generation later, or whatever it is, you have a chance to observe it and reflect. You say, well, maybe that change wasn't so bad. Maybe that change is actually fine. And I think there's like some of the changes that you think we've stopped, that we've prevented from happening, like nuclear power, for example, right? Like we made a decision in the later part of the 20th century that we thought nuclear power was bad and that we didn't want this change. So we're not going to make nuclear power plants. We're not going to produce nuclear power. And I think people were just wrong about this, in the sense that if you presented the world in which we had made a different choice and made the change, that people would, on reflection, endorse the world that they saw as better. And they would say, well, yeah, this is good.
So you asked for specifics, so I could list, most ancients, if they, were introduced to a modern world, some of the things that they would be put off by, at least, they would be put off by, no longer worshiping their gods, no longer respecting their family lineages, no longer treating their family elders with the same sort of respect, talking back to a great many authorities around them, being more self-indulgent, caring more about romance versus, say, family devotion. People are more promiscuous than they used to be, self-indulgent in many ways. These are some of the things that would certainly bother them. In addition, many of them would be bothered by just, the great way we command and destroy nature often. I mean, that would give people pause often. These are some of the things that would bother people.
So I think there's a very large systematic thing about like nature is kind of a separate question perhaps, but like the first set of things are all like kind of a very broad pattern, I would say, in this instinctively, which is things that were necessary to maintain like economic prosperity and social order, or like because of the nature of the past environment, right? That right.
So some changes, some features are functional, that is, they are adapted to their environment culturally or genetically, and other features are more free-floating and could have been different, certainly. If we're talking about the adaptive features, then a concern is going to be that the future world will be different, and then the features that adapt to it will be different. And then you might not like those. So the question is, do you just want the features to be whatever are adaptive, or do you want the features you like? And
I would say, I think most humans actually have some features that they believe in because they think they're adaptive, but they don't particularly inherently like them, except that they feel that they're better than the alternative of not adapting.
Right.
And then there are other features that they think are inherently valuable, And it's not necessarily clear to me, how they decide how most people decide which ones are in which category, or whether there's a systematic, like, legitimate way that they go about doing that. But if you are worshiping an ancient god, right? I think there's like an important distinction between two types of ancient gods. There's the type of ancient gods that sort of had a contract basis with the people they were working with. Like, when you worship the god Apollo, you're kind of like, okay, Apollo does things for people who worship Apollo, and like isn't as nice to people who don't worship Apollo. So if you know what's good for you, you'll make your sacrifices to Apollo. And I think that, if you transported somebody to a future world where, they realized that there was clearly no reason to sacrifice to Apollo in terms of like getting practical benefits, like they would say, well, of course you shouldn't worship Apollo, right? You found better gods.
But certainly many attitudes toward marriage and children and family and nation and war and jobs and life and death, most people's attitudes for most of the things in their head are not about functionality. They're not thinking about which of those features are functional. They are much more directly attached to their culture's choices on those things.
I'd say most people, they don't think carefully about exactly why these things are what they are, and especially as they get older, right? Like I think as people are younger, they're more flexible.
Right. Another claim I want to make is that as cultures change over time, arguments are a relatively minor, weak influence over how things change. So if you're used to a new world now and that you lived in a different world in the past, I'm skeptical that arguments are the main thing that made you more comfortable with the new world than the past. I would more think we're just all tend to go along with our world. We get used to it, we become accepting of it. And then as the world changes, our acceptance changes in part to get along, although when you're older, often you're more resistant to changes. So it's not clear to me the fact that you've experienced change across your life, and now the later you endorses the changes. It's not that clear much evidence to me that the earlier you would have endorsed them.
I mean, it's definitely, I can think of some changes that I think were bad, right? Like including things that like most people don't think are bad. I don't think it's necessarily forgetting in those particular details, but like
Sure.
There's definitely a distinction. And like, I do think that I am much more inclined to change my beliefs based on argument than with other people. So I think your statement is true of most people in general. Not sure to what extent it's true of me, but definitely think that there's a lot of truth in general. But if people would go along with those values, so like one can draw a distinction between values that if I were to take someone into the future, right? Like transport someone to a different world, either continuously over time or through some technology, that they would adapt to that new world and basically like say, okay, now that the economic situation and the norms and culture have changed, I'm just going to go along with this, especially if they were relatively young. And the ones in which they would say, no, I think something has gone wrong here.
So let's take some concrete examples. So as you know, I wrote this book, Age of M,
right.
And my working analysis framework was, competition to figure out what would be an equilibrium. And so I'm trying to describe what are the adaptive behaviors in that world. And that's my main way to figure out what happens there. And many people in our world read about that world and they don't like it. You recently did some polls, and one of your 20 scenarios was that scenario, and it came out kind of in the middle. It's not whole dystopia, but it's far from utopia. So many people would disapprove of the values that change in that scenario. That's the main reason, I presume half of them put it as, bad scenarios rather than good ones, right?
Well, so my presumption is, in fact, that I tried to be as fair as possible in the summary,
Right.
which
Sure.
is not very long, but the idea of the question of the Age of M on the list was essentially, there's going to be non-carbon based, right, non-biological like life that emerges from the Age of M, and it's going to have a lot of changes in its architectures and in its values, and do you have, exactly. What do you think of that future where you don't have a lot of control over, like, we don't deliberate in the Age of M,
Right.
and choose the values that we want? It's simply like which values win in a capitalistic, competitive arena. And a lot of people said, well, I don't think that world is going to have a lot of the things that I value about a world.
But part of why they don't like the world is the values of creatures in that world change, that they have different values.
Yeah, basically, but I mean, there's obviously the question of, when someone's values change, when the world's values change, does this mean that we care inherently about what the values of the agents of the world are, or do we care about what things happen in the world due to the agents having those values? And it's a mix of both, I think.
Okay, but I think when people are afraid of the future, they're afraid of the combination of that mix. I'm not sure they care that much about the two components, right?
Yeah.
So we can just aggregate those two when we're thinking about the future.
Yeah.
We can just say, in the future, humans will be different as a combination of them living in a different world and they're having different value reactions to it. And those are two things that will go on. But the net effect will be they'll be very different, and people today wouldn't like that. And that's also what I would claim of the past.
So I think that if you proposed a broad range of potential changes, right, and this is a series of polls one could run, that some changes that are distinct from our current world would be seen as neutral or actively good. Other changes would be seen as somewhat bad, and some changes would be seen as catastrophically bad. And that people really do care about these details. And you could attempt to model, obviously, which changes people would like or dislike, but that there's details in the age of M that people are relatively skeptical of, versus what they would expect in a human, no AI, no M world as the kind of changes that would happen. I think they're less skeptical than in an AI dominated world. Some of the scenarios that did very poorly, right, were scenarios in which we build artificial intelligences that are not human, and they take over. And it didn't seem to matter much whether or not they respected property rights and let current humans retire and have a nice little window. That's clearly not what was primarily going on, right? Primarily what was going on was most of the future is going to belong to these very alien things, right? As people saw it, these things that I don't care about, that I don't attach moral value to.
So in the initial framing here, we could say changes happen in the past. We should expect more change in the future. Do most people think that on average change would be good without AI or not? That's just an objective question. It can be a mixture in the middle. And then with AI, do they think that makes a difference? And if so, what's the difference they think that makes to the long-term trajectory of the future, or perhaps how fast it happens? So is the reason people are concerned about AI risk because they're just generically on reflection, scared of where the future would go even without AI? Or is it they're scared that AI will bring us there faster? Or do they think that AI takes us somewhere different?
So, I think yes.
I
think they are in fact afraid of all of these things.
Okay.
And I think that they have good reason to be afraid of separately all of these things by their own values as they express them. Whether or not you think you have different, I think the main disagreement that we really have at core, more than anything else, is in fact that you approve of and value the future that you are advocating for. And a lot of other people are very skeptical that this future has any value.
I'm not sure I picked a very particular future here. So
No,
we
right,
have a range of options.
Yes, but very broadly construed the types of
right, but the point is to separate out these. Yes, if they object to it, we're trying to break it into pieces. That's the point of this analysis, right?
Right. So my noticing, I notice if you proposed, we are going to go back to the values of ancient Greece or even ancient China, right? I don't even know that much about the details of exactly what in 3000 BC they valued in the river basins. I noticed that I'm sad about this change in values because these values are not my values, and they don't seem very adaptive, and they don't seem very as interesting, and they don't seem to, and specifically the things that I care about, a lot of them would be lost. And I feel like sort of the intellectual lives of these people would be impoverished with those values, even if they had access to modern information tech and a bunch of other similar things. But I noticed that I am strongly that world is a good world. That world is a valuable world. If I could get a galaxy or a universe, a grabby alien ancient China, right? Where that's the equilibrium values, I'm that's 100% of the possible value that I would ascribe to what values these people could have, but it's like at least 10. Right? It's like good enough that like it would be very, very easy for me to endorse, let's just be grabby that way, because there's just so much space out there to be valuable in, right? In some broad sense. And, there might be a handful of past societies where there was like enough actual deliberate negative infliction and suffering where you might question this. But I would say for the vast majority of what we've seen, there's something about the way humans have adapted to all past situations that like I instinctively see value in, and I think most people would endorse some version of this. Unless they were strongly religiously like, only Jesus has value or, whatever.
So is the argument here that because random pasts seem to have a net positive value, that we would see random futures as having a net positive value, so that we would then be relatively positively disposed toward typical change?
Right. So my actual perspective here is that there are the physical mechanisms involved in humans who require certain sets of resources and associations and cognitive functions, and genetically are rewarded and punished in various ways for various types of relationships, and move in certain ways in physical space and communicate with certain senses and certain modes and other similar limitations in natures, right? Under a wide variety of technologies and situations and sets of economic opportunities and values and resources, are very inevitably going to create like these complex interactions and situations where I notice there are like the types of experiences and struggles and interactions and complexities that create things that I think have value, right? And to the extent that I have processed what I think has value.
So I'm struggling to connect that to the framing of the questions where we say, you can either answer it from your point of view or maybe a typical person that we are channeling's point of view. Do we think that a future of similar degrees of change to the past, stretching out indefinitely, is on average a good thing and we're just willing to endorse it? Or do we think on average it's a bad thing and we want to prevent it, except maybe if it's really slow, we don't mind. And if it happens fast, we mind? And do we think AI makes that sort of distribution of outcomes substantially different, i.e. worse or better?
Right.
That's the framing the question. So I'm not understanding how your discussion of China helps.
So what I was trying to get at there, and I wasn't, maybe didn't complete the thought yet, right? So, but the idea was that there are certain like inherences in the structures of the relationships between humans in physical space as physical biological humans that we could expect to be, that aspect of us has not much changed, right? In this period, it's been very quick. Our biology has not had much chance to evolve in meaningful ways. That if we held our biologies to be in these ways not too dissimilar, and we didn't build machines that like obliterated too many key aspects of the things that I'm describing, which we haven't yet, that we would expect that however people arrange themselves in those worlds, that those arrangements would continue to be things that people found to be somewhat valuable. Now, if I had to guess what the average person's preferences in terms of change would be, their preference would be something like, I have a specific narrow set of changes that I really, really want, right? Like there's this, some of them are very, very local and very narrow and very personal. Or, I want my family to be bigger and happier and more prosperous, but also I want like, this song to be really popular because I thought it was really great, and I want this bean to be eaten more, and blah blah blah. They have a bunch of very specific things, and a lot of people have like more general things potentially that they think are very important, but that the vast majority of people would oppose almost all major changes, you might suggest, like serious major changes to
okay. So then the median person's median preference or whatever is roughly short-term change okay, long-term change not so okay, and then they maybe don't mind the long-term change happening as long as it's out of their horizon of view.
So the question of like how they think about this, mostly I think they don't. Discount rates, right? How much they care about like the equilibrium, when we get to an equilibrium, is a question. I think the more, I think if you present it to them, like if you reach the salience of the fact that we're going to get into equilibrium, that we're going to have a large amount of experience in the future, they'll care about those features more, quite a lot more. And I think this is one of those things where like everyone just kind of goes day to day, kind of assuming that the future won't be that different from the past. And then like, therefore, it's not like their normal values are just kind of assuming the future's going to be normal.
But if we postulate that we make people see the actual future,
yes,
1,000 million billion years in the future, and then we ask them, what do you think? Then I think we're agreeing that most people would be quite shocked and initially repelled by it. And then there's this possibility that enough argument or exposure could change their mind, but the sort of initial reaction would be pretty negative.
I think, right. So I think that like, they would almost certainly say it would have been much better if we had kept something much closer to my values while getting all of this material abundance.
And so from that, maybe not deeply reflective point of view, maybe most people would want to shut down change. In the long run, they want to shut down big changes, maybe allow the small ones, like make their garden better because they were trying to make a nicer garden.
So I do think there's like, different types of major change, but like certainly like sufficiently large change, right? Like, I think almost, yes, I think that like for the most part, people value things like their cultures, their friends, their families, themselves, So
we could ask specifically, what if nuclear energy went wild and the future had a lot more energy? Or what if genetic engineering went wild? What if people went off of Earth to colonize the solar system? What if we allow AI to go wild, and proving that just generically large categories like that will seem, scary. And if they could vote, they'd probably vote to take them off the list of options.
So again, like I think so I find nuclear power to be a very interesting specific case, because I think if people were actually, if you were to show them the nuclear powered future or even present, like you say, go back to 1950 and just nobody ever had any objections to nuclear power.
Yep.
Right. I think they would strongly endorse the version of 2023 that they saw, right? Assuming that everyone had kind of equal luck in terms of like the specific people involved or whatever. Whereas like they're opposing it, I think they are actually just making a mistake, right? In an important sense.
So, but we might ask, what kind of is it a systematic mistake? So for example, it might just generically be true that any detailed future, if you live there for 20 years, you'd find it okay, but described abstractly from a distance, you wouldn't like it. You might just disapprove of things described abstractly because
in the sense that like, I think that like, if you were to build more, if we were to have like, instead built a lot more coal plants than we did, I would like that alternative future less. Like,
we'll say, take genetic engineering, like when described in the abstract, saying people could change their nature more fundamentally, most people are scared and reject that. If they met the people who had changed genetically, they might like them and decide they were better people, but they never meet them. That what they do is they see some abstract description of a space of possibility that contains some stuff that seems scary, and that's the main
I think they are
basis of the reaction.
I would favor allowing genetic engineering, but I don't think people are like being foolish when they worry about potential very bad effects of genetic engineering.
Okay. And if change happens faster, then we presume that people get more concerned about these sorts of changes.
On multiple levels, right? I think that they're both like, so the one sense in which, okay, if change is happening, then there's a certain period in which I get to enjoy the world before it changes too much. And I get to like extract, like, there was value to be had in the world before it changed too much, right? And then like over time, the world becomes less and less valuable. So like, I'd like it to change slower. But there's also a sense in which you would expect fast changes potentially be different than the accumulation of more slower changes.
Well, fast changes are going to have more overlap of people from different experience levels or backgrounds, right? So that's one consequence of fast change.
One consequence. But sort of there's the things in which, like, if you are doing slow change, you're doing a kind of form of hill climbing, right? Like where you are considering moving from this point to this like adjacent point. And then if that change isn't good, that doesn't make people appreciate that change and endorse that change, and like there's enough negativity, then you can kind of roll it back. If you're changing big things really fast, right? Like you're moving much farther in the space of possible worlds, and you might not have the ability to go back. You might not have the ability to object. It might break a lot of other things.
Well, so at the moment, the world economy is doubling roughly every 15 years. A few hundred years ago, it was doubling every 1,000. More than 20,000 years ago was doubling every 250,000. You might have, from the past perspective, look at our rate of change and say that really couldn't be of the sort you're saying, where we're adapting, because that's too fast to adapt. But is in fact our current world not doing adaptive change? What's the rate at which adaptive rate change can happen? I would flip it around and say our ability to adapt to change is in fact one of the major limitations on how fast change can happen. Change won't happen faster until we get better at adapting to faster change.
Well, who's we, right?
Whatever is the dominant actors in the economy would be the ones who need to adapt faster. Yes.
Right. So while there are humans who are the primary drivers of the economy, who have to think like humans and move on human timescales and have human levels of memory and human levels
right.
in their ways, that I think we are, reasonably close. Certainly these past few months have felt like, I can reorient, I can get my OODA loops like just barely to work with the amount of news that's happening, so I can like understand the situation. But
I think the world economy could double every year and we would still be adapting. I don't think it would be a non-adaptive process, but we could talk about the degrees to which you're adapting, or have the precision with which you're adapting. I mean, even today, as you probably know, if you look at the productivity of plants in the world, or even in the US, they vary by like a factor of 2. So we're in a world where that's the degree of precision of our adaptation.
But my expectation is that the world economy was in fact doubling every 2 years, or every year across the board. That, obviously, to keep doing that, if humans were in charge, the humans would have to be handling it pretty well in some sense, or at least a large portion, or it wouldn't happen.
Right.
But my expectation of the median human in that world is they would actually just be completely boggled by it. Like they would. Or
it would happen out of their view. So I think actually today, most people don't have the impression that the world economy doubles every 15 years because most changes actually happen in the background. I think a century and 2 centuries ago, it was more happening in their face. And so change was, in fact, the same rate of change was a lot more socially disruptive, say around 1900, because we didn't do most of them in the background. We made people move from, country to cities, and we made them move on a horse to a car. And like, these were big changes that were in their face. And there was just a lot more social disruption then. And today, when things get twice as good, you could mostly live your life the way you did 15 years ago without changing your habits.
Certainly, to the extent that like the world that I'm living in Manhattan has been, hasn't been doubling every 15 years. It's been significantly slower than that. Like, I think the numbers say it's significantly slower than that, but also like, it definitely doesn't feel like the average person is enjoying, twice as much stuff every 15 years or anything like that. Right. Like, certainly you've got access to like important, valuable new tech that I think is great. But, certainly like I'm getting into, there are reasonable arguments about like whether the average person is actually in a worse position than they were. And I also think it's like very arguable that we are doing a halfway decent job of adapting to the current rate of change and the current situation in 21st century America. Like, I see a lot of signs that we're not handling it very well.
So for the purpose of the main topic, though, it seems we agree here that people plausibly will be more scared and concerned about more rapid change.
Yeah, I think people also, keep in mind that, like, historically speaking, when there was a lot of rapid change, it usually involved things like invading armies, right? It was often very, very bad.
Sure.
So like, it makes sense to, and in general, like, you've optimized your mind and your family and your world and your strategies and your skills around what is now. And like, you can only have so many children, but you can all die. So like, this kind of risk aversion on change makes perfect sense. Right?
Okay, so we a simple story about the world's reaction to AI as a reference story to, knock down or improve on would be that usually we don't see the future with much clarity. And so we're usually not confronted with these issues of where the future will go and whether we'll like it. And usually changes at a relatively continuous rate that we in the past have adapted to, so we feel okay with adapting to it now. But recently people saw this AI demo, and that demo let them envision in their mind a bigger change in the future coming, and that scared them. It not only let them envision a bigger change, but that it would happen fast. And it's like the analogy when people can envision a big nuclear accident, that makes them worried about allowing nuclear energy. Without that imagination, people wouldn't have objected so much to nuclear energy. If they were just reacting to the actual personal experience with it, it wouldn't have been so much of a problem. It's because they could imagine this big thing that might happen as a result. So similarly with AI, we might say it's the ability to imagine this much more advanced AI system and make it vivid and make them believe it's actually coming, and that it might be coming fast, that would trigger their concern about large-scale change and rapid change. And that by itself, that would be enough to make many people say, oh, this doesn't sound so good, and perhaps explain the usual poll results, say.
But I often, like, in my thinking, I separate like AI change concerns into like two broad buckets of things to be concerned about, right? You've got the near-term, practical, like, changes, things like the section "they took our jobs," right? Like the kind of things where it's like, okay, AI developed, and now like this concrete specific thing works in a concrete different way, and now like my ability to navigate the world, my ability to earn a living, et cetera, have been changed in these specific ways. The distribution of wealth may have changed in these specific ways. Things that like the world is still in some sense recognizable, but is changed and different. And in those areas, yeah, I think we see a lot of people who are afraid of change because it's change to a large extent.
But even those are imagined changes. That's different than actually losing your job and actually like hearing your uncle lost his job. We're not in that world at the moment where we saw actual consequences, but they're seeing, is they're able to imagine those consequences, and that's what concerns them.
I think we are starting, I think you are, from the things that I have seen you write in general, underestimating the extent to which things are actually changing now on this basis. But I do agree that, like, for the most part, when people are significantly afraid of AI, mostly they're not afraid of the changes that have already happened. They're extrapolating those changes and into the future. Right. I think correctly so, right? Like, I think that like the changes will be much, much bigger in the future, even if we don't see these other even bigger changes after that.
Okay.
If it is baked in. And
so you were distinguishing those concerns from another set of concerns.
Right. So the other set of concerns, which I call, I think of as the existential concerns, are things like, worlds in which there won't be biological humans for very long, right? Or like worlds in which, the entirety of the atoms of the solar system are rearranged by some entity the way that it wants to, or by some collaboration of entities, or just in general worlds in which like control of the future is no longer determined by biological humans, right? Like this thing where like humans can, like the optimization pressures, the people who own the entities that control most of the wealth, they determine most of the outcomes, they determine like the nature of physical reality. Those entities are no longer human beings, right? Like those entities are something else.
So I would phrase that as fixating on a particular partiality, a particular axis of difference, which is, as you restate, biological humans versus other things. And, having a very high priority to that axis compared to all the other axes of allegiance or change. That seems to me, in fact, where people go when you push them on the topic. They just go, well, there's us and them, and the them might, become more powerful and capable and rich and able than us. And then we'd be at their mercy and full stop and divert.
I would take the might in some sense out of that. But yes, I would say, most people I think would strongly endorse the idea that if we were to create, AI entities, at least AI entities that were not carefully sculpted in terms of their values and their priorities and their composition and like what type of minds they were and what they were to do, they were simply selected for various types of competitive pressures, right? Or whatever we could build faster. in some sense, right? Like, or, whatever we got to
Right.
work, that,
So
yeah.
that's the reason I tried to do this initial setup, because it seems to me they're holding these AIs to a different standard than they would hold their children or grandchildren or descendants. That is, with respect to their biological descendants, they are much more accepting of them having different values, of different practices, different attitudes. With respect to the AIs, they demand a much higher standard of allegiance and conformity and similarity.
So I would say at least two things here, right? The first thing of which is, yes, I would in fact demand that. I think that is very reasonable. And I think this is a very good place to be partial. And that, like, it's been very adaptive to be partial in this particular way. And that I actually think that, like, a lot of what creates the values that I care about is in fact being partial in these types of ways. And if you are, like, broadly indifferent between, like, all of the configurations of matter that might, like, exhibit optimization pressure, that seems worse. Like,
Great. Because I want to plant my flag here with a tentative disagreement, and then we could see where we could go with it. But I want to argue that, in fact, this sort of allegiance, this sort of partiality is not adaptive in a very precise technical sense. It's not adaptive, and therefore maybe we should, on reflection, embrace it less than we were initially inclined to do so. So I agree that we must always have some partialities. That is, evolution, cultural and genetic doesn't really work without some degree of partiality. That is, each version of the population needs to be in some way promoting things like itself in order for, not just for evolution to promote it, but for many ways for the world to function. That is, it's too hard for us to just uniformly promote everything. We need to have a focus, and this is important.
And I'm certainly open
focus.
I'm certainly open to the possibility, right, that I am being, either too partial or not partial enough on this particular axis relative to the
right. So that's
or,
exactly where I want to go with the conversation, if you will. So first, we could just note different kinds of partialities. Like, let's make
I just, one more thing I want to say before we get to that, just because I think it's important to frame the general conversation, which is, I would also say that I think what people are, one of the reasons people are so partial about this particular axis is because they think that, like, the characteristics I was talking about of biological humans and the less variant or invariant aspects of them and the way that they interact with each other and with the environment lead to the expectation that future biological humans of this type, even if a lot of change were to take place, were to in fact be much more likely to hew much closer to a lot of the values that we care about on reflection, and a lot of more about values in general. And that if we were to create artificial intelligences, it's not just that we would like, in some sense, hold them to a higher standard. It's that I would expect them to not meet any reasonable standard for which I might hold my grandchildren. Right? I think if I had a grandchild who acted like I expect an AI to act, I'd be like, who the hell was this alien? What even is going on? Like, what happened? And I am so confused.
So this is the key question then. Like, you're arguing that there's a correlation between this axis and other axes you care about. That is, if we allow variation on this axis, we will indirectly produce variation across the other things you care about. That's a claim that we have here. And that's an argument as the basis for why we should care about this one, because it's a proxy for a whole bunch of other ones.
That is, yeah. So I definitely do claim that. Okay. And I also have this claim that, like, sort of part of I actually have this sort of deeper claim that, like, even if there was no other reason to be partial on this axis, that part of the dynamics that lead to the outcomes that I want, and therefore the things that I value, one of the things I value is having some amount of partiality on this axis. Although, like, having too much partiality would in fact go too far. But
so I want to walk through some examples of what I call infertile factions as opposed to fertile factions. So a faction is another way for it, a side of a partiality axis. So examples of fertile factions i.e. things that you would, so the idea is if you were to promote your side of a faction on average, would that on average promote your genes or memes? That would be a concept of fertility.
Right.
And so we could say promoting your race, your family, your geographic region, those are examples of fertile factions. That is, if you promote your geographic region, it'll on average contain more of your genes or memes, and that will on average, promote those aspects of you into the future. So those are the things on which I might then endorse. I might say, more abstractly, I might just say, I'm not sure what I want. How do I know what I want? One way to figure out what I want is, do I have a theory that predicts I want this? And then if I have a theory that predicts I want this, then I might be more willing to say, okay, I do want that. Whereas if I don't have a theory that predicts I want this, I might think, well, maybe that's more of just a mistake. But that's, it's weak, but it's a consideration. So I'm going to say, at least with respect to these fertile factions, I have a theory that says I should be partial to those factions, and I am. And so I might be willing to retain those partial
Right.
choices.
And obviously, your family and your species are fertile factions.
Okay. Now let's walk through some not so fertile factions. One might be generation. Promoting your generation at the expense of, say, a future generation doesn't really promote your genes or memes. It's not the sort of way you can make things accumulate in the long run, because in the long run has to include the future generations.
So I do think it's worth taking an example, a clearly suspect faction, right? As a first step, and then sort of exploring, why would I do that anyway? Right?
It's just what, to me, a clearest example. So I have many more examples.
Which is sort of the reason why I want to stop right there, right? Because we take one that's so obviously terrible, and yet doesn't get us into trouble for discussing it, and then we can sort of explore why might I want to endorse my generation anyway. And so the first obvious example is that if there is a faction, if factions are going to form at all, even if they are infertile, right, the one in which you are going to be placed by the other factions,
sure,
is a thing.
So there can just be a game theoretic equilibrium where a coalition forms. You need to support your coalition, because otherwise they will punish you for not supporting their coalition. That can just be a social equilibrium can exist that way, but it's not a behavior that's going to promote the evolution of that behavior. It's not a evolutionary reinforcing behavior there. It's just a game theoretic behavior.
If you include memes, right, you could obviously claim that, people in my generation will have been exposed to much of the same cultural factors and memes and media and so on, and therefore will have more of the same memes than my children, than people who were born 20 years later, or people who were born 20 years earlier. And so maybe I should support the cultural influence of my generation.
Except if we're carrying what memes will be in 5 generations, then you're promoting your generation over the next generation doesn't obviously make it last for 5 generations. It's more likely the next generation can influence future generations than you can. So, hurting the next generation in order to benefit your generation doesn't seem to help 5 generations in the future.
I mean, if we have a model of we have an n-dimensional vector space or something, where n is very large, and then every generation attempts to move in a random direction or something, right? Just a simple model. And then the question of well, if I want to support the particular vector that my generation has, right, versus the next generation of the previous generation, then if I shift resources from the next generation to my generation in support of my generation's vector, then the vector that exists in 5 generations will be slightly closer to in expectation to my generation's vector than it would have been otherwise, right? I have some amount of fertility here.
I mean, if you're just increasing without hurting another one, I was talking about a relative thing where you're helping your generation at the expense of another generation. So, and at the expense of a later generation. So,
right. And then the question becomes when we say at the expense, right? Certainly if you're saying well, I'm going to transfer economic resources and then we're going to eat better, right? Eat better food.
Right.
And we would have, and the people in the future will eat worse food. And that's not a very fertile thing to do. I mean, it might be I mean, you might want to eat better food, right? Like you might just want
Sure,
utility.
right.
Like aside
But-
from that, yeah. But like if
but
I'm
for our purposes, this is enough. I just, that acknowledging that point seems to be enough for my purposes. We don't need this to be very precise.
okay,
But I just wanted to, I'll make a few more examples. Okay. Say in biological evolution, at least gender, promoting your gender doesn't help when there's this evolutionary region why the genders should be roughly equally divided. And basically, if you make one gender have an advantage, then that borderline will just adjust to compensate, and you won't really be helping the rest of your genes in the long run by promoting your gender. Similarly, if there's other mixed strategy equilibria, like often personality types are claimed to be, then if you promote one element of the mixed strategy over another, then
yes. So I'm right. So I'm actually skeptical of the particular example there of the personality types, because I've definitely seen aspects of culture that favor a different, even if there is an equilibrium for a given cultural setting and set of norms, right? Where like, given that we're all going to act in these particular ways, there are certain niches and they play off against each other. But certainly like there are aspects of the world that like could go one way and could go another way, that could favor introverts or they could favor extroverts, right? Norms could change in ways that favor one or the other, that change the equilibrium. And so like when I say, I'm going to favor introverts over extroverts, I'm going to favor nerds over jocks, I'm going to favor, various types of this thing, in terms of my means, these actually seem fertile to me.
Well, the question, if it's not a mixed strategy equilibrium, then that's certainly true. I was just pointing out that some people do postulate these as mixed strategy equilibrium, in which case you can't so much help. I'm
basically saying that like, it's a multiple mixed equilibria game or something like that.
So let me go on to my next example.
Yeah.
My next example would be Earth humans over space humans. So let's say in the future, some humans might leave Earth and go out into space in the solar system, and then they could prosper out there and perhaps prosper more than the humans left on Earth. And then at that point, Earth humans might become a minority or backwater of the solar system and lose out in the competition between Earth humans and space humans. And then we could say, because there are no space humans yet, we can win this contest right now by preventing anyone from leaving Earth. If we prevent them from leaving Earth, the space humans all lose and the Earth humans win, yay us.
So so to be clear, like, if we were having a vote, I would vote for space humans, like hands down. In the real world.
Nevertheless, the question is, does this make sense as a partiality? Is it a fertile faction is my question to promote Earth humans?
So I think that like details matter, but certainly first of all, for memes, it seems like it's quite possibly very fertile, right? In the sense that like conditions on Earth are very different than conditions in space. If you put humans into space, they will necessarily adapt certain very different values. If those space humans then have strong influence over future memes, and memes are what you care about, then I certainly think that like for certain values, you should very much not want people to go into space if those are your values. And that's all you care about. And then the question of, for your other aspects, well, so like the dynamics of what would happen, like the physical dynamics, the physical interactions, the physical incentives change dramatically when you go into space and you put substantial numbers of humans in space. So like the moon is a harsh mistress, right? Like if potentially people in space could get strong physical leverage over the Earth,
right,
then they could impose very different sets of values on those on the Earth. So, they could even limit the prosperity. The prosperity of the solar system might actually be lower even, right? If most of the places that you could reasonably live are actually on Earth just because of the nature of physical reality, you might say that like, putting a small number of people on the moon or Mars might actually make things worse. Right, because like it might cause so much more death and destruction or limitation or more devotion to sense.
But assuming we believe, in fact, the solar system economy will be much larger if we expand into space, then it could make sense for you to favor people staying on Earth if, say, your features were a complement to Earth relative to other people's features. So say other people would just do better in space than you. And maybe you get nauseous in space or something and they don't. And then you might favor people not going into space because of your partiality to something correlated with how well you do in space, but it wouldn't make sense as a general issue for everybody on Earth to have a coalition together to oppose space humans. It would make sense for some particular Earth humans who had particular disadvantages in space, but not in general across Earth
again,
humans.
I think that, like, in terms of, if we talk about genes and we talk about memes, right? Like, if we're talking about
For both.
right, we're
We're
talking
talking
about
about both.
we're talking about memes. I think, again, like, if you have memes that like are very attached to Earth circumstances,
Right. So that's what I'm saying. Some memes will do better on Earth, but other memes will do better in space.
but I would say on average, you would expect more change, and you would expect current memes to on average do worse under a solar system economy than under an Earth economy.
But that's current memes compared to not yet existing future memes. Right?
Right.
Similar, like current humans compared to not yet existing future space humans. So the idea is that in a genetic analysis, say the simplest sort of natural selection analysis, if you have a population in a territory and then a new territory opens up, the genes win by colonizing the new territory. Preventing anybody from leaving the new territory is only of an advantage to some of the genes, perhaps relative to others, but it's not an overall advantage of the population to prevent the expansion of the new territory.
Unless the expansion of the new territory increases genetic change.
But all the change will be descended from the current genes. That is, under an evolution analysis, you want to maximize the frequency of not just the exact genes you have, but its descendant genes as well. So if you're trying to maximize your lineage, not just your current version, then all of those future versions count as your lineage. And you want them to prosper.
You might care about the details, potentially quite a lot, of the people who are your lineage, not just that they are your lineage in some technical sense, especially if they're not your genetic lineage. Definitely the question of whether or not they count at all in some important sense. And I think a lot of people would say they don't. But, if you expand into a different area, and then that area has different selective pressures such that people in that area would then evolve to be substantially different than you, then, and on average, this is true because you are adapted to wherever you happen to be, right, in expectation. Then if that area would then be able to exert power over you, you might want to worry a bit. And I am jumping ahead to your next question.
Right.
I know what it is. Right. Which is that, if you were to send rockets into space to colonize other solar systems, then, it becomes in some sense like physically impossible, as we understand physics, to have that much influence over what happens at a different star. Right. And so at that point, right, you would have this problem of we would be unable at any point from that point on to collectively agree to limit or direct change to any specific place. And in fact, depending on the dynamics of how this physically worked, we might have to be forced to evolve our genes and our means and what physically comprised our solar system to like something very close to the maximally, powerful configuration, right? Like if you had to worry about being attacked by forces from other solar systems at some point in the future, after many years of compounded technological and economic growth of some kind, right, where they got slowly more powerful, then, and especially if there was like very remarkably little time to react in a meaningful sense, right, you might have to vote, like, you might have to like say, well, we can't just be humans anymore, and we can't afford our art and our music and our love and our other things that we care about, because we have to defend ourselves against people who chose to give those things up, whoever they may be, because out there's a million other planets, and on one of them they did that.
Right. So I think we're getting close to a core question here that we may not be able to resolve it, but at least I think it's progress to identify it. The core question here is, I think it is well described in this Earth versus space version, not necessarily other solar systems, just within our one solar system, which is, do you identify yourself with the particular features of an Earth human, or do you identify yourself with a genetic lineage that could have descendants in space, and then they would count toward your success, even if they're somewhat different from you? There's the choice between identifying with the specific you that you are now versus a a lineage that's been changing over time would continue to change. That seems to me a key choice. And there's probably different ways to model evolution where one wins versus the other. I mean, I'm guessing modelers have enough cleverness that they can do that. But, you know, my intuition is that a creature whose main loyalty is to its lineage will just win out in evolutionary competition over a creature whose main loyalty to it's to its current configuration. As environments change and context changes, the one that's willing to adapt is more adaptive.
The one that's willing to adapt is by default, like one would assume, is more adaptive, but there's also the possibility that the thing that doesn't want change, right, could in fact assert an equilibrium and prevent change.
And the question is, which of those habits is on average adaptive if you expect to not always be able to control change?
Well, I mean, we should ask ourselves, you know, obviously, as we move toward the future, you know, how much control could we have? How much influence could we have over what the final equilibriums are, over what directions and magnitudes these changes are, and whether we have preferences over which directions and magnitudes we have.
So I would assume we have limited change. We have limited ability to change, and we have to be careful where we spend it. A limited budget, right, of what we can do.
We have a limited budget and certainly influence over, you know, what directions those changes take, and what that looks like. And, you know, there's certainly some amount of path dependence. Like, I don't think that, like, you know, the decisions that we choose to make, to the extent that we have the ability to make different decisions, like, we look at the final configurations of matter and say they're all exactly the same. Or we look at, like, you know, the changes of types of beings that exist.
But I'm not claiming they're all the same, just to be clear. But the way I think I was going to go, so after the Earth versus space thing, my next example is like bio versus artificial.
Right.
If you think of our world is full of genes and memes expressed in biology, which could alternatively be expressed in artificial forms, then we can have descendants in the artificial world. And if we are willing to embrace those descendants, then they can be our allies in helping our lineage to grow. So when they are allowed to be one of us. If you declare them, you know, by definition, cannot be one of us, then they cannot be in our lineage, and their success cannot be our success. But that's the question.
So what do you mean by when you say they could have our genes, right? Because, like, they won't have genes at all. It's an important step, right? They'll have code.
But certainly they can have our memes. They could have our adders. And then if you think of, we have many design features, they could inherit some of our design features and some of our key choices. So for example, you know, they can inherit our choice between democracy and autocracy, you know, between English and Chinese. You know, there's a whole bunch of things that we've chosen that we identify with, we are even aligned with, that they could inherit those choices and perpetuate them.
So I noticed that I don't think we know how to do that with anything like the current architectures and paradigms that, like, might plausibly lead to AI soon.
Well, I mean, surely if we imagine an alien civilization somewhere out there in the universe, they're biological, they're making their own AIs. Surely our AIs will be correlated with us compared to their AIs, right? Our AIs will, in fact, inherit many features of humans compared to the alien AIs inheriting the alien features.
I think that seems really obvious. I think it depends a lot on how we go about implementing those AIs, and that if we do a sufficiently botched job of it, and I think that's, like, not implausible at all, that no, you won't be able to tell that they came from humans. Like the resulting grabby thing, if we get a resulting grabby thing, will be just, like, fully optimized to be doing the thing that it's doing, and, like, would have emerged, like, from could have emerged from any number of other alien.
So I will try to disagree by speaking of legacies. So if we have an evolutionary context, say, where evolutionary pressures are simple and strong enough that there's a unique answer, then evolution will produce that unique answer and none of the origin points will matter, right? So the question is our future that strong and unique of an evolutionary outcome or not? So in our world today, we have a lot of competition and evolution, but we have many kinds of legacies that seem contrary to this idea that there's a single unique evolutionary endpoint that everything will just end up at. So I agree that if you have strong evolutionary pressures and there's a unique endpoint, then we all go to the endpoint, and then nothing is inherited, period, right? But today, for example, the location of cities is something that is a legacy. That is, they could have been located somewhere else, and had they been located somewhere else, the city would have grown up around that somewhere else. But once it's in a particular place, they're hard to move. And so there are many kinds of standards like that. The choice of computer languages, human languages, many kinds of standards in our world, and things like cities, it's kind of a standard, a place we all coordinate on, have this feature that they can get locked in. And once they're locked in, the world prefers to stay next to that than something else. So this is the idea of multiple equilibria, really, in game theory. Right. Evolutionary theory is complicated enough in practice to have multiple equilibria, and that's where our heritage can be, in the multiple equilibria choices.
So there's several possible responses to that. So the first possible response to that is a strong argument for thinking carefully about what legacies we might want and how we might lock those legacies in a way that was hard to change, right? Because we might have some control over which legacies of these types we could pass on, and like different ways of transitioning from our current world to a future world would have a lot of influence over what those legacies might or might not be. And some legacies we might care about, some legacies we might not care about. I don't think we care, right, if the future is based in Python versus the world is based in Haskell, right, in terms of like my values, little, but like not very much,
right?
Whereas like there's some other things I might care about a lot. But the second thing is that, like, sort of to the extent that we have those legacies, like, it's about the strength of the evolutionary pressures, right, and the ability to optimize and change and adapt versus the rewards and punishments for adapting or failing to adapt. And I would assert that when you're talking about computer programs that can be redesigned, modified, copied, shut down, rolled back, experimented on, spun up, et cetera, very, very quickly in a variety of ways compared to biological humans, and that will be subject to a lot of competitive and capitalistic pressures under the type of scenarios you're talking about, where something that's even slightly superior will be able to quickly spread over something that's even slightly inferior, that you will have dramatically stronger evolutionary pressures being asserted on these entities than is asserted on us, and that they will reach their endpoints much quicker and more aggressively, whatever those endpoints might be under the circumstances. And those endpoints will then, and then this change will then change our circumstances in other ways, which will create a new endpoint based on that, which will change it again, will change it again, will change it again. And that, like, a number of these steps will be long after we're all dead, right? And so, if we're talking about these types of evolutions, well, like, what legacies are going to survive?
So I think I'm hearing the claim that a computer-based world, an artificial world, has fewer legacies. It has a smaller dimensional space of multiple equilibria. There's fewer things you could lock in. Is that correct?
I think it's broadly correct. Certainly less meaningful, or like,
Well, so whether you care about them is a separate issue than whether there are just fewer of them. But you could also claim whatever fewer ones there are, you care less, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, like, certainly, and to the extent that we have, our current computer world has legacies, it is largely because it is based on the biological world. And therefore, these legacies are very difficult to change.
That seems just not at all true. That not remotely true. That is, I was a computer engineer for 9 years. I don't know how long you were, but the point is, computer stuff has all these legacies and lock-ins, which have almost nothing to do with the biological world. They are quite native to the computer world. It's just a matter of large, complicated systems, really, that has the legacies. And that's also true of biology. I would think most of the biologies and legacies are consequences of having such complicated systems. Naturally, complicated systems just have more multiple equilibria in many dimensions.
So to be clear, like, what I was trying to, the intuition I was pointing at there was that because changes in the computer systems have to be directed by the biological entities and understood and organized by the biological entities.
I
But
don't think that's true at all. No, that seems not remotely true. That is, I mean, actually, well, we know some things about what happens when computers try to write code versus humans write code, but that's, I guess, a little more speculative here. But so fundamentally, so we have a similar issue in economics. So think of a nation with a dominant, I don't know, cement company.
Sure.
Okay. There's a cement industry and there's a dominant firm in the cement industry. And one of the things that elites in that country do is they preserve the dominant players in each industry through political connections. And one of the things outsiders recommend, like the World Bank, in order to promote growth in a country like that, is allow more competition in these industries, allow entrants to threaten the existing incumbent who makes cement the way they do. And this suggests that if you try to lock in legacies too early, if you have an arrangement, we say, we like this arrangement, we want to resist change, that can sort of prevent growth and improvement along many other dimensions. And you could think of an alliance of many different, dimensions of consideration, many sort of factions, really, just wanting to promote growth, because even though that comes at the expense of some of these other factions and they're hoping to maintain an entrenched position, it allows the entire society to grow. And that's a key trade-off we've been facing for a long time. That's in some sense why we've allowed so many changes, is that we've said, well, places who don't allow changes tend to get outcompeted by others in the longer run. And so if you don't control the whole world, you have to be pretty wary about trying to lock in temporary things that you like at the expense of allowing entrance and competition to improve efficiency.
yeah, and you always have to have this trade-off, right? Like you want to have the things that you care about, and that you have to be competitive, right? If you're not sufficiently competitive, if you require too many things, if you try to lock in too many things that you want, they're
Right.
not, they are anti-competitive, you pay too high a price, you got competed, and then someone else's stuff gets imposed on you, and you end up having to change even more stuff in ways that you don't like.
Right. And that's been the driver of change for most of history. And the question is, dare we, throttle that engine or not?
Dare we not? But there's also dare we let that engine run is another question, right? Like it's all framing.
Right. But we at least know what letting this engine run is like. We see that. And then the question is, there are these risks with respect to throttling the engine. And that's the thing to discuss, right?
I guess this is like one of the fundamental things that like I think we do disagree on, is that like, you think that like, well, we've seen this engine run. We know how this story goes. We can more or less describe this. And I'm saying that like, there is a distinct difference here where we are going to run a very different type of engine that is going to do a very different type of change in thing, if the thing that we choose to do is to create general intelligence in a computer that is not human.
So here's a claim you may agree, I'm not sure whether you'll agree with. It's that, say our ambition was to become grabby aliens, spread across the next nearest million galaxies, meet the other nearest grabby aliens, and then earn their respect so that the nearest 1,000 grabby alien civilization who hear of our accomplishments and styles are often inspired to copy them because we have the best. We want this long-term future, and this is over the next 100 billion years. We want to be this respected culture, and then after 150 billion years roughly, they have to separate because of energy. If we don't fix the energy problem, then that'll be the end of the story. But if this was our ambition, then this is the standards we have to compare to ourselves. We say, well, we need to meet the competitive standards of what the other grabby alien civilizations will have when we meet them in 1 billion years.
So that's that's nothing I said, but I think it's a very interesting proposal for like what we should aim for.
Right, but it sets the reference case of, can you stop competition now? Are we good enough now? And by this standard, it looks remotely no. We're a long way away from being the best by this standard. So
Well,
we would need to allow a lot more competition and evolution if we want to win this game.
So I want to bring in another concept of yours, actually, from a while back, which you called the dream time.
Yes.
So this is the idea that, right, like for the last, however long, certainly the last few hundred years or something, we have enjoyed a very strangely unusual amount of physical surplus in our agents, right?
Per capita, at least.
Per capita, right? And so we have been able to use that for a variety of not immediately competitive, play and exploration and extraction of enjoyment, utility, and value in various types as we determine. And, basically, as I understood your framing, it was like, well, notice that the dream time is recent, and notice that the dream time is temporary. It's not going to last very long because the competitive pressures will catch up to us.
Right.
Then we're all going to be back to the right. You'll have to wake up again.
Right.
You have to look at the other world, and not that the other world is bad, right? It doesn't have no value.
Right.
But
it's not below zero, at least.
It's not below zero. I agree, strongly agree. But it's very different. And, what if we said we didn't want that? Right? Like, what if we think that, like, in order to create the civilization that these other grabby aliens, like, how do we create a civilization that the grabby aliens that we meet we're proud of? Well, if what we do is we just maximize the fraction of the speed of light by which we can expand out, and we maximize like the efficiency of all of the various mechanical probes and devices that we use to construct our systems, and we try to grab as much territory as possible, and the things that grab territory less end up with almost none of the territory, and they miss out because there's no more galaxies left, there's no more space left to claim because everything else moves slightly faster, and now they're just shut out, and they have very limited physical resources, and then they get overpowered by the remaining people who have access to vastly more physical resources. Then we end up with a slackless, non-dreaming civilization that is like very optimized, has very little legacy, and that like doesn't do the kind of things that I would expect. I have expected all the grabby aliens that this civilization meets in a billion years. Like, not this is what I value at all. Like, this is like, I never thought about this before, right? Like the other grabby aliens see that and I'm like, oh, it's one of those.
Yeah.
Right. Like, it's like, okay, I'm not impressed. Like, I'm not like mad. It is what it is, right? Like, but like, I am so not impressed. And maybe it's also like, okay, we've got to man our defensive borders because these are the type of things that push into us, that like try to attack us and don't respect us.
Right.
We got to go on a war footing and reveal nothing because like we're trying to preserve something that we find of value, and they gave that up. And like, I noticed that when I look at this endpoint, right, like that is just being ruthless about grabbing these things, and like, I'm guessing I don't care, and I wish we hadn't done it, right? That like, I think that like we just wasted space that could have been used by a different grabby alien that would have at least done something, right? And like, we could have done something interesting with Earth, and let someone else like maybe grab those galaxies in a useful way. Like that, I'm like less like, I think that like there's so little legacy left, as you describe it, in that strategy, like so little left that I care about, that like I would roll the dice on a random other alien and hope they didn't do this. Because the worst case scenarios, they're exactly the same.
So my bet is that even a competitive, evolved grabby alien civilization will still have many legacies, so that when they meet, they will learn things from each other. But there still may be fewer of them in some other scenarios. So maybe a scenario with more slack somehow enforced can have more legacies. I've been focused on the choice of allowing any interstellar colonization. And it seems to me that the motives and attitudes you're describing, when applied at that moment of that choice, would tend pretty strongly to lead to saying no to interstellar colonization, at least for an extended pause. Because, if you had a civilization with some degree of central coordination, which, enforced some degree of slack, they would know that they could continue that indefinitely if they limited their civilization to being with, or not indefinitely, but for the next billion years, if they prevented interstellar colonization. And that might be an attractive scenario, billion years seeming to them perhaps to be sufficient. And then that in my mind is the best reason why I might think many civilizations that are quiet don't become loud or grabby. That is, they they've enjoyed for a long time the benefits of having a civilization-wide governance that's limited competition and war and prevented evolution into strangeness and allowed an awful lot of slack and legacies within the scope of that, say, solar system. And then allowing any interstellar colonization would then plausibly be the end of that era. Within a few thousand years, the descendants of those colonists will go in many directions, including back to the origin, and come back and contest the origin, as you discussed, and that would be the end of their era.
I mean, I would certainly, I would say if we were to like make this one time, assuming that the physics of the world still look maybe like we think they look now by the time we have to make this decision and we figure out how to send the colonists, I would say, certainly if we launch the colonists the first minute we figure out how to launch any colonists to launch the first new world and didn't give any thought whatsoever to trying to influence the values or plans or intentions of those colonists, that seems dumb, right? Like that just seems dumb to me. Like we're not going to lose, like if instead of 1 billion years, we have 1 billion years minus 1,000 years or minus 2 years, like of interstellar expansion before we hit the border, like in this,
right.
Assuming the gravity aliens principle.
I agree 1,000 years by itself is not much consideration, but I'm much more concerned about once you start the local social equilibrium in a pause, whether they'll be able to break out of that to switch to another plan. I also just don't believe it's going to be very possible to install sufficient political agents in the colonists to ensure that they never deviate from some initial constitution.
I wasn't thinking so much about installing political agents in the colonists, but more about doing, a bunch of theory and figuring out, like, depending on the initial conditions that you set, and depending on what resources you give them, and which direction you send them to first, and various other elements of what you might do, like what legacies can you install in these systems that you think would in fact be preserved, right, in your term legacies. Right.
I think by the time we know this, when this second choice is, we'll already know the answer to these questions as much as we ever will. So there wouldn't be actually that much point for waiting another 1,000 years. We would either know the answer one way or the other.
If that's true, right? If we know all that we're going to know, and the time comes to decide, then we also potentially would know what they would evolve to if we let them loose and what the universe would look like. And we would have to decide, okay, does this future universe, how much value?
Obviously, this topic was nominally AI risk, but if we bring this back to AI risk, the analogy here is many people are saying allowing AIs to evolve now would be unwise until we figure out how to let them evolve in a way that we can control their values indefinitely into the future. And I find that just implausible that you'll ever be able to do that. And that is, I think the sort of creatures that you could ensure that their values wouldn't change would be greatly impoverished and hindered in their abilities to evolve and grow and become interesting new things.
You certainly, by your structure, agree that, the reason why we would create these things at all, if it meant there was no future for humans in their current form as a result, right? Which again, I strongly don't want to do that, but if you were to do that, it would be because of legacies that they would have, right? Because they would have some things that we valued that made them different from other similar things that came from other systems, right?
We would see them as inheriting valuable things from us. So certainly ChatGPT and other large language models quite clearly inherit a lot of us, right? The question is now more about what other kinds of things would inherit. But like we talked about, there's always the question of, like in economics, if we allow full economic competition, then future cement companies, how much similarity do they have to current cement companies? Well, maybe just the fact they make cement, but then they're maybe the most competitive cement companies. So it seems clear that to the extent that you want to impose some legacies and have some slack, you have a limited budget for that if you are facing any substantial competitive threats or pressures. So actually in Age of M book, I did this analysis of saying, like, using a log normal distribution over abilities to say the most productive M is how much more productive than the second most productive M. And that gives you the estimate of their slack. That is how much they can slack off and still, stay in the best job, right?
So in my model of this for biological humans, what's going on is that in large part, like we have Slack partly because we happen to enjoy actual surplus, which we can just spend on Slack. We also enjoy Slack because what looks from the outside to a naive person who doesn't understand what Slack is, like wasted Slack, right? Some amount of that is necessary to actually like get the training data and experiences and so on for humans in order, and like that process is valuable. But if humans could be freely copied, rewound, modified, etc., in other ways, that Slack no longer serves a purpose, right? That Slack just goes away.
Wait, what? So I think you're thinking of play, right?
Yeah.
One of the things we enjoy about ourselves is play, and we often think of play as a waste, some sort of leisure extra that we have to pay for, and in competition would make us no longer.
Yeah, some very broadly defined form of play, where play includes like all the seeking out of positive experiences that don't seem directly productive in any way.
It's also even true of rest. So, I mean, we have a literature on rest that shows that people, in order to be maximally productive, actually need quite a lot of rest. Yes. So rest is necessary for work, and therefore rest is not slack. But a lot of play is also necessary for work, in the sense that you have to experiment with different things and try different things and explore different things in order to be productive in many things.
To me, like this is a lot of the reason why I'm so confident that like the non-dream time humans in the past, before the dream time, like clearly had very positive experiences even when they were quite poor, because they would have been less productive and less adapted if they didn't have those experiences. They need to have them.
So going back to our initial framing, it seems like you have some beliefs about how a default AI future is substantially different than a default non-AI future, even though you accept appears that the humans would continue to change indefinitely across a very wide scope. Nevertheless, you see that human future is just having more room for legacies, more room for slack, and the AI world is having less room. And that's, in some sense, your primary reason for being wary of the AIs, that you want to make sure we figure out how to fill them with more legacies before we let them go loose.
Well, that is certainly some of it. It's a large portion of it. I would say that's my sort of like, what? So that's in addition to the simple, like, I just noticed I do have a lot of partiality about this. I do care about this a lot. And I'm sort of saying, like, in terms of when I try to like explain like the version of that that's not coming from me doing it because it is in my interest to be partial, but actually coming from like some sort of endorsed on reflection set of values that like isn't partial for some reason. Like why the impartial version of me that isn't like necessarily caring about humans per se still likes the human world. Yeah, like that's basically the intuition pump that is coming from, I think. Like I noticed that like I have a lot of confusion about how to create like the most valuable like future worlds under abundance, right? Like
let me note that a lot of people are very confident very quickly that the human future is better than the AI future, and then they reach for a pretty wide range of explanations. That phenomena could be explained by their just feeling partial and then wanting to justify it, right? So that makes us want to look more carefully at any given justification offered for why.
I feel like I can certainly imagine potential AI futures that I am confident I would find no value, right? Like worlds that.
But are they typical, or are they extreme and unrepresentative? And that's the question. What do representative AI futures look like?
Well, the real reason is, that's a hard question to answer, right? Like we don't really have a good idea of what exactly those end states look like. But so like,
I have the hypothesis to offer, which is that generically larger biospheres, larger biolineages, larger economies, larger populations just have more legacies. They just have more complexity, and complexity gives more places for legacies. So if the AI counterfactual world is just much bigger and more complicated, then it will just have a lot more slots for things to get stuck.
So
Just look at our world today versus a world from 100,000 years ago, right? We just have a lot more legacies in our world.
So would it, interesting question for you. Over the last, let's say 30, 40 years, maybe, would you say that like more parts of the world are becoming more different or more similar to each other?
There's convergence on some dimensions and divergence on others. So for example, think of music, right? More music is being sung in English. So if we look at the linguistic divergence of music, it's being reduced. But if we look within the English music, we would see more divergence in styles.
So
because it's larger, can support more different subgenres, more different variety.
So I think we definitely see a long tail of more variety, but I think we are in fact seeing, in my experience, like increasing domination of a more same thing over, like, as we are seeing more algorithmic, more systematic, more competitive pressures applied to many areas of life, I'm seeing a lot more of like, I travel around the country and it's the same, and I browse around and it's all like kind of the same. And like, we figured out what works in some important sense, and the complexity is going down.
So for example, in the United States, different regions of the United States are now more similar to each other, but you can get more kinds of restaurants in any one particular size city than you could 50 years ago or 100 years ago.
Yeah.
So similarly, you have more kinds of big box stores, for example, because each of these big box stores is spread across the whole nation. So in any one place, you see there's less geographic variety in what kind of stores you have in any one place. In the past, you could go to a particular New England town and see unique stores you would never see anywhere else because you were in that New England town or something. And now you will see the same stores in that New England town you will see everywhere else in the country.
I see it as something like we're humans have preference for a lot of, there's currently a diverse set of humans who each have its preference for diversity of experiences and, an economy that interacts in complex ways, but that we are sort of figuring out like what the optimal way to handle a lot of that is under current conditions pretty quickly.
I'm confident in claiming that over the long run, the increasing size of the economy has been giving more space for diversity and variety and more legacies, therefore more things to lock in. So once upon a time, there might be just the one best kind, the one, having Thai food at all was a new innovation. And now there's a dozen different kinds of Thai food.
There is?
That represents legacies. Because now those different kinds get locked in, whereas once upon a time, it was Thai food going to get locked in. And, pad Thai got locked in as the most popular dish in a Thai restaurant, say. That was a legacy, still preserved at the moment, honestly. But
like if pad Thai is not supposed to be the most popular, it won't survive that long as the most popular, right? In some important sense.
Okay, my general claim, though, is a larger, higher capacity economy will just have more legacies. There's just more things that get locked in compared to in a small economy. So that's maybe a big argument for AI, is to say it will allow a much larger economy with more agents, more kinds of agents, more parts, more different ways they interact, more kinds of languages, for example, that they can talk with each other in, more kinds of activities.
Right. So you wrote The Age of M. So in The Age of M, right, like how many different M's, like, would you estimate exist at one time, right? Because like if there's 1,000 Taylor Swifts, like I'm counting that as one, right? Like in some important sense.
So in The Age of M, most of it's focused on the early parts of The Age of M, where the minds can't be modified, they're just selected. So we take the 8 billion humans and we select however many M's are the most productive, and then we make copies of those. So my rough guess is there's less than 1,000 humans, constitute, the copies of those are, most of the M economy, at least initially, is composed of them. But then each one of those initial humans now fragments into many variations based on which profession they're in, which city they live in, things like that. They are, in some sense, more similar to each other than humans are today, but there's a lot more of them. So, I would think there'd probably be a lot more different jobs that the M's
So
do.
why isn't the M age dominated by like short running copies that are like spun up at the precise moment in
So most copies are what I call stubs, who, are made and do a short few hour task and then are erased. That is, fewer copies are saved to pass on to the next day because you have to pay extra for them to rest up for the next day. But they're fine with this. They're used to it and it doesn't bother them. It might bother us in looking at them, but I don't see that that's intersecting with variety so much. But I have when I give talks, I have a slide about new kinds of variety in this world. So for example, they vary in speeds. We don't vary so much in speeds. They can vary in how much of their mind is sort of cut out and thrown away because they don't need it, trying to be more and more efficiently. They can vary in a lot of other ways that we don't vary, but I would say the age of M. So for example, one standard thing I say is age of M is going to have fewer bigger cities. And people who live in a big city like you, I guess, live in now, often say, I couldn't live in a small town. There's not enough going on there. I need a place with all the stuff that's happening here. And that's what they probably say about your big cities compared to their cities. Your city hardly has anything going on. They'll have much more variety of things happening that any one person could get to within a few minutes travel. And that's, in a sense, the variety and complexity that comes from scale.
So when you say like the economy will double every month, like what would it physically look like for the economy to double 10 times from here?
Well, since we have this idea of an M as a certain size unit of computation, then we're expecting that the cost per M goes down over time so that the number of M's is increasing faster than the economy increases. So then if you went and looked at the, memory locations constituting an M and counted them, you're going to count more over time at faster than that rate.
Why wouldn't we see an ever increasing ratio of stubs to M's, right, in this world?
Oh, because the ratio is based on, so the trade-off is if you do a non-stub, you have it do a task, then it remembers having done that task.
Yes.
And it learns from doing that task. When you make a stub, you have a factor of 2 or 3 in efficiency because you don't have to have it rest for the next day, but you do lose out on, it doesn't remember ever doing this and it doesn't learn from doing it. So that's a cost.
But also when I think about humans, like if you get me into the exact moment where I have been like configured such that I am like ready to maximally pursue a specific task.
Right. Yeah.
It's very productive. So like I think I can get a much bigger edge by like optimizing the steps pretty aggressively once they know what a task is. So unless they need this additional training data, right? Like from these extra tasks, like, and as the economy grows larger, like there's gonna be more and more tasks where like any given already super optimized stub is actually the optimal way to deal with this task.
So I'm not sure if this is right, but I think I was going on the assumption that as the economy gets larger, the number of different tasks increases and sort of the number of people doing any one task, the median stays more in the same range. So as the economy gets larger, so that's the key ratio here. How many copies are there doing any one task?
I guess that's sort of like what's even happening then. Like when you say there are lots of these different actions, like,
so obviously the more you could standardize a job, the more you can get scale economies of having the very best copy do all of them, right? That's true of software today even, right? But standardizing has limited gains that often there's cost of trying to standardize things that are actually different. So often we have advantages from making variety of workers and tools. And so there's a trade-off there in many kinds of tools between having standard, cheaper tools versus having a wider variety of tools. And that workers are tools. So it has that same sort of trade-off. So if you look at like if you're a programmer or you have a toolkit of tools you use and that have used before and you know what they are, and the more specialized you get and the more experience you are, the larger a toolkit you'll have at your disposal. But each tool does a particular thing. And, there's tools you could do that are more general, but they don't do it as well as the specialized version of the tool. But specialized version of the tool has an extra fixed cost to make it. So you have a trade-off there.
Yeah, so I noticed that by default, I don't expect this type of rich, complex, because when you describe the age of M as if you imagine all of these different virtual beings are getting all of this rest and getting all of this play on a continuous basis, and they need it, and that's actually the most efficient way the most efficient way for you to actually use them. And then these M's are then creating lots of demand for things due to their play and their rest in some sense, and their operation elsewhere, which then,
I wouldn't assume the play and rest is most of the demand. I think most of the demand is from work, but there is some demand from play and rest.
So if most of it's work, then what's the work going towards, right?
Existence. You're paying to exist.
I work to get credits for. I work to get credits so I can use them to exist. But where I work for someone else, what does that someone else benefit? What am I doing for that person?
So, it's the same as 1,000 years ago in a subsistence farming economy, right? In a subsistence economy, we can relatively easily figure out where most of the effort is going. It's going into the things required to subsist. So in a subsistence farming economy, most of the work is farming. And, if you have to sleep in a building or you freeze to death, and you have to make buildings, if you need clothes, otherwise you'll burn in the sun.
So it's all going to
make clothes, right? So it's all going, but it's all going to compute and the supporting systems for compute. So you need energy and structural support and cooling and manufacturing and, disaster response and, transportation. There's just all these things you need to support the compute. Yes. But, nobody does work without being able to compute their minds as they do it. So it all needs compute.
That just hits physical limits pretty fast, right?
No, not fast. Well, I mean, certainly within a million years, sure. But, an economy that doubles every month, if you do the numbers, it can't last very many millennia on Earth, right?
Can't last very many years.
Right. So, a factor of 1,000 in a year, then in maybe a century, it's running into limits on Earth. Yes.
A century. So if the economy grows by 1,000, how much is compute? How much power? How much is use of how much is power use growing that?
So my key working analysis was to say how many doublings did previous eras go through before something fundamentally changed, and then there's not much point in analyzing this era through more doublings than that. That is, something fundamentally would happen to change this whole era anyway after a certain number of doublings. So why bother to push the projection farther?
Yeah, I thinking about physical limits. There's only so much power there's only so much energy coming from the sun.
Right.
You generate energy
so it's clearly we will hit those limits within a million years, right? Perhaps even within 1,000. Right? Okay, but it doesn't really matter how fast, right? The point is, there's a whole era before you hit the limits, and we can at least think about that. And it's harder to think about what happens when you do hit the limits, but we can think about that too. Obviously, what happens when you hit the limits is you have to slow down and you can't grow as fast, and you are more eager to go at the edge and expand. That's just how it goes. But I mean, so you might postulate that during an era of rapid growth, we would have all this complexity and variety, but somehow when we hit limits, that would mostly go away. That might be a hypothesis you could offer. And civilization would collapse in complexity, say, down to very simple things. So, for example, at the very edge of the expansion wave, you might argue that can't be very complicated. And
what did you call them? Hard scrabble frontier folk?
Yeah, right. So I have a paper on that, right, describing hard scrabble frontier. But yeah, so my analysis of the frontier is that they have relatively simple strategies, at least as I analyzed. And so you could say that has limited scope for complexity or legacies there.
But the frontier is most of what matters, right?
Well, it's only temporarily the frontier. It's very quickly no longer the frontier. So the question is, what happens in the wake after a frontier wave passes?
So but then we reach these worlds are hyper competitive and they reach an equilibrium, right? So the age, like a lot of the attributes of this world that are interesting because it's doubling, right?
Yeah.
Human experience under like large amounts of economic growth, right? Where things are improving, like are substantially different than the worlds, which like.
But notice how different this is from our earlier discussion where we talked about people being afraid of fast change and being more comfortable with worlds that were changing more slowly.
I mean, I'm not worried about people we're uncomfortable with. Like
Yeah.
Basically, okay. So I can imagine a variety of like ways that the Earth's atoms could be rearranged if like we suddenly get the capability to do so, or like some entity gets the capability to do so. And like,
I think you should be surprised by the diversity of the biosphere. I think if you had just on fundamental grounds said what sort of creatures would evolve in a, on a planet where sunlight comes down and there's nutrients around and it needs to crunch them, you might have said, well, there's just one optimal equilibrium. There's a certain kind of organism that sits on the surface of the water and takes the sun and chunks it out. And there would just be a huge convergence in biology such that there's just the one organism that survives. And that's really quite at odds with reality. So I think you should reflect on why is the biosphere so farly different?
So why do you think that's true?
Once you look at the high dimensional space possible of interactions between creatures and even just the different kind of places they could be, you start to see all these different places for specialization and legacies. In some sense,
so I would claim that a lot of that is about the inherent complexity of the physical conditions that these creatures have to face. That especially at their level of optimization and intelligence and the amount of like complexity of instruction you can store inside.
But if you fly over the Amazon basin or over the Arctic and you go, yeah, the ground's varying a little, it doesn't look like it's varying that much. How can that little bit of variation on the ground matter so much for the variety of creatures down there? Or over the ocean, say the same thing. Like, okay, this ocean is a little more saline. This has little waves a little higher, but come on, the pH is a little higher over here. But how much could those differences really matter for the variety of sea life? And you'll be just really surprised with the variety of sea life that comes out of what seem like relatively small variations in conditions.
And I noticed that like where humans have applied a lot of optimization pressure, and there are a lot of humans living there, this biological diversity goes dramatically down.
Well, our needs are simple. So when we want to just maximize whatever fish or plant is useful to us, then we kill all the rest and crank up the max whatever's useful to us, because our needs are relatively simple now.
Yeah, and I would expect us to continue doing that, right? Like with or without AI.
So we do know that apparently there's a much more biodiversity on land than in the ocean, and much more around rivers than in ordinary land. And larger species actually have less innovation than smaller ones in aggregate, which is in contrast, say, to cities on Earth or even firms on Earth. So there's something interesting going on there in that difference that I'm calling to your attention because it's related to this topic. So in the world economy today, bigger nations, bigger cities, bigger firms even have more innovation per person. But that's not true for biological species. Biological species that are smaller and more specialized locations like rivers have more innovation per individual or per biomass. And that's just a striking difference in need of explanation. So that shows you how there's a lot of things we don't understand about what causes more diversity or variety in the long run. And it's then for both of us, it's an open question. Okay, if we want more diversity and variety and more places for legacies, we don't really know which places those are. And maybe we need to study that more, because that sounds like a really important question.
I mean, I noticed the places that are subject to like algorithmic optimizations, to like the things that work, like being able to rapidly, be copied and distributed, especially if minimal effort, seem to be the places that have decreasing diversity over time relative to other places, to me, in a lot of ways. And I also noticed that like the dynamics that cause power to be in an equilibrium amongst humans, both like almost failed quite a lot, or often ran into just physical communication limits or physical or like communication coordination limits in the past. And like in a more centralized world with more leverage points and more strict economic competition, like I don't particularly see a reason to expect that this equilibrium will hold and there won't be a takeover of some kind.
So you admit at the moment, bigger cities have more diversity per person today.
Right now, bigger cities have more diversity per person today. Yes.
And they have for a long time. That's been a thing true for many centuries.
I think there's various. So my understanding of why that's true, I mean, part of that is that like the diversity of the city is like why you would choose to live in the city. Like cities have lower fertility, cities have lower health,
Yeah.
Historically until very recently, right? Cities like,
Okay, those are relatively minor correction. Even without those things, cities would still have much more diversity. This is we have some standard econ of cities.
I mean, I haven't studied this, like, I just like going across the way, but yeah, I mean, I can see why cities would have more diversity.
There's just more scope for specialization, right?
Yeah, economically more valuable, right? They have more surplus, they have more specialization, right?
And specialization is diversity, literally. So then you might ask, what's the scope for future specialization? Then maybe that's the way to ask. So I think many people imagining AI, they imagine the AGI, the general agent, and then they think because it's general, it can be equally good at anything, even compared to specialized versions, that there's not much scope for specialization in the AI world. That seems quite implausible to me. Although there's going to be some things where generality is an advantage. So certainly it's noteworthy that humans are much more general than most other animals, and our generality has allowed us to fragment out and take a huge fraction of.
I noticed that I've been
resources.
I noticed I've been surprised by the near-term generality of systems, right? In the sense that like I expected people to much more aggressively specialize AI systems for practical usage than they are doing. And I'm actually still confused about that. I don't understand why it's not right for them to do that.
I predict, though, the first versions of any product are more general than the later versions. That is, as an industry grows and expands, products will become more specialized in general. And that's therefore why the current generality of AI may be misleading about future AI.
Yeah, it's possible they just haven't had the time to tinker with the things and figure out how this stuff works. True. I do expect them to like kind of be theme and variations to a large extent, but because just the way the costs are.
But certainly if we're looking for evidence about complexity, the biosphere and human economies are our main evidence today about where we should expect complexity and variety to appear versus where we expect homogeneity to appear.
So you don't share the intuition that the characteristics of interacting in physical space, of having genomes that evolve like through sexual selection, of like having to deal with like these long-term cycles and iterations, like none of the things that like are distinct, make computers distinct from humans. You don't think these things are significant drivers of the diversity that we're seeing. You think it's mostly about interactions between different agents with different strategies.
I'm sure those features have some effects. I just don't know how to estimate their sign with respect to these parameters we're focusing on. I expect some of them increase the diversity and some of them decrease it. And I'd have to think that through to figure out which. I don't have any particular expectation that that package of features produces more overall diversity than any other package of features. I mean, the main thing is to say something allowed humans to beat all the other animals on the earth. And you want a decent theory of what that was, because that's this huge transition from the biosphere to the economy. And so certainly one element is an aspect of generality of the human mind and the human culture, flexibility. So there's a sense in which, I mean, this is another example, right? Humans represent a vast reduction in diversity of the animal world. Nevertheless, within the human world, we're creating enormous diversity in the human economy, and we will create enormous diversity in our descendants.
Right. And your expectation is that if we were to replace humans with artificial intelligences, which is in your mind the same thing as creating the artificial intelligences in the first place, unless we severely cripple them, as I understand your position, then
in the long run.
How long is the long run?
Well, I'm more confident in talking in terms of doubling times than years. That is
right. But I'm pointing out the long run is like years, right? In physical, like you're predicting doubling times of a month.
Okay. And so then in 3 years, you've got 10, 30 doublings, right? A factor
right. So
in
3 years,
that's
the
a factor
world
of a billion. So that seems like
years,
enough time.
So either the physical world is completely unrecognizable to humans, or
right.
like almost all the things are just completely invisible to humans. And like you would expect the humans to like not physically survive for very long past that point.
They wouldn't sit in the central dominant places. I'm much more hopeful they can survive on a margin in retirement. That's
but only in retirement, right? We're not talking like, it's not
right.
a stable situation. Like we're not gonna
yeah.
So yeah. And then like your research essentially is you expect these computers, these AIs, to create a sufficiently complex set of dynamics amongst themselves, just based on whatever initial conditions happen to be set for them, that we should be comfortable unleashing whatever our capitalistic and like programming whims set for them. And this will like both capture enough of our legacies that we'll feel it's special, and it will retain like sufficient amounts of complexity and interestingness in some broad sense that like
right.
we think there's value there, essentially, is your assertion. Something like that.
Right. The parameters that would make you lean more toward this view relative to not, one of the key ones is how much you're going to just embrace your simple intuition of us versus them, which many people really do, and sort of biohumans versus the machines. We're loyal to our side of that divide. The more you just feel that's an obvious answer, and many people do, then that's where you are. You're just going to go there and say, even if it cripples the future, biohumans must survive, and they must be roughly like we are, and that's just something I'm going to insist on, and many people do. So in order to go my direction, you're going to have to be willing to reconsider that intuition. And of course, I think moral philosophy and what we know about intuitions in general just says, hey, most people are way overconfident in their intuitions. They should really be reconsidering pretty much everything. But you should be willing to reconsider that intuition. And especially in the light of how much do you care about your descendants going big, doing huge things, spreading across the universe, impressing the other grabby aliens, but that will require they evolve a lot, and that you allow and support the continued competitive evolution process to go out and discover all those capacities that they could discover and achieve. But if you're going to try to limit the evolution, but still want to discover all those capacities, you're going to have to be doing a pretty difficult managing job, right?
So essentially, to have this viewpoint, right, like where this is preferable, you have to be in this position where you view the AIs that you create as having enough legacies, being your progeny in a meaningful sense, that like you care about them uniquely as opposed to different things. You think they would preserve enough of the things that you care about.
This is why I point you to the most plausible future without AI. And I say, you weren't thinking carefully. Like if you think about it, you'll realize that even without AI, your humans' descendants will not only evolve to be strange culturally as your ancestors have, but they'll mess with their genes. They'll mess with putting metal stuff in their bodies. Your descendants will be cyborgs and artificial in a great many ways, even without AI, maybe M's, maybe other things. That was just going to happen anyway, unless you controlled evolution to prevent that. So it's not enough just to prevent AI. You'll need to stop other forms of evolution and competition if you wanted to prevent this other default future of, again, evolving to strangers, where
Also
you will
for-
share a few legacies with them.
In the long run, I mean, you could also simply assert that, like, if you allow colonization, you interstellar colonization, you don't prevent AI, right? Like, there's
Yes, right. In some sense, yes. That's
so
true.
it's even easier, right? Like, we can strengthen that case even more so. But yeah, I would say sort of, you know, if it turns out that, you know, we can't create artificial intelligences, or we can't create these other types of modifications in ways that we feel like, you know, would allow us to retain that which we value, whatever we decide that is on reflection, then why would we do it? Right? Like, we have to, I mean, if we think that, like, that's the way things are going to go, inevitably, if we do that. But also, we might find out that we have more control over this than we realize. Like, you know, obviously, like a lot of these questions, you know, we should in fact study the question of, do we have leverage over these questions, right? Like, could we gain the knowledge of whether we would have leverage over these questions? Could we create a period of time in which we would have our values intact with control and enough power and knowledge to be able to reason well and make decisions about these things and implement choices we might make? Can we, you know,
I'll just highlight a key fact here, which is, in the past, we've lived in a competitive, decentralized world where nobody's run the world, and therefore we've had to accept the result of decentralized competitive choices. In order to, even if we know a lot about how in general to manage our evolution and change, in order to take advantage of that knowledge, we will have to institute some system of global governance to enforce it. And that's a thing we aren't very experienced with and has enormous perils. So in some sense, that's the thing I'm most scared about that path, is if you don't understand just what you're trying to pull there. We are not very experienced with that. And there's a lot of ways that can go wrong.
There are a lot of ways that can go wrong. I don't disagree. But, you know, if you think that the alternative path is that much, I mean, this is clearly, like, if you're going to spend your one time, right, in some sense, to, you know, risk it all to try and influence the future path.
I mean, this is a way that futurism weighs in on traditional debates about political economy. In the past, people had focused on their lives at the moment and said, what's good, more or less government, freedom or or management, etc. They had a set of considerations they invoked. And now futurists are coming in with the trump card saying, well, turns out you just need a lot of governance if you wanted to preserve everything you value into the future. So forget all these other considerations. We got to go with strong governance.
I mean, I share, as you know, your instinct that absent these considerations, that strong governance is bad. Like,
okay, but so this is interesting. Like, I think this message deserves to be told to the people who debate political economy. And of course, the futurists deserve to hear from political economy all the reasons people are pretty wary of the solution.
I mean, I try to emphasize, like, every time I advocate, we might need to do some government intervention here. Like, by the way, stop doing all the other government interventions. I'm pulling the one time. Like, this is the exception. Stop it. You know, like, and
but this one will encourage others, right? The question is, can you do just this one, or doing this one will be part of a system that encourages many others?
The dream is you're like, well, you know, we only have so many government control points, so let's spend them on this. And in exchange, let's build a bunch of nuclear plants and a bunch of housing, and like, let's regulate all the occupations, and let's go. Right. But
so this is one of the key points in political economy that's difficult, is in understanding what are the actual levers of change. You're postulating a lever of change that I'm not sure is an actual lever.
No.
It's very hard to hear.
To be clear, like, I wasn't saying that was like a real option there. Like, there's a reason why I try to, you know, emphasize, like, just explaining how I see all the things, rather than like trying to do what I see as like the easiest push towards getting this particular change. Because, like, I see the push towards, like, if I were to take the easiest path towards stopping AI change, I'd be encouraging lots of other bad changes that would be especially bad if we stopped AI.
Yeah.
I'd like to find a way not to do that. But like, I also think
Right.
that like a lot of your, and many people who share your views in various forms, reluctance to do this is exactly that, right? Like it's that, well, we've already done so many restrictions that make no sense whatsoever. Like that not only
Right.
like they're just unproductive. They're not even like, I preserve my values now, but in exchange for that, like the future is some little bit impoverished. It's no, you're just everyone's lives just suck. Like they could be
Yeah.
less sucky, and instead they suck because
Right.
you wouldn't build any houses. It's like you suck. And like instead, we could just not do that. And like we would, and obviously a handful of people would be
Right.
worse off that we could compensate them, but we probably wouldn't, et cetera, et cetera. But like, and you have this attitude of, well, in that case, like, what's the world like if we don't build AI? And like, I don't, the world if we don't build AI and then eventually on reflection, decide that we're going to colonize space anyway and we're going to build AI anyway, now that we understand it better after like some period of developing more technologies and we know how to influence how this is going to go, and maybe we do in fact create an impoverished version of AI on purpose or something, like whatever. But like, clearly your worry is that, we're not going to do any of that. We're just not going to do anything at all, right? Like you're like,
Right.
well, screw gravity. We're not even get to Mars,
Right.
Like not any
Right.
meaningful way. Just gonna sit around.
So you like moral mazes as much as I did, and it's a warning about how bad governance structures can be, even on small scales, and they get even worse on larger scales. And so there is this really key question of, at what scope do you think we can be rational planning actors in terms of collecting ourselves together into larger units? So you might think that you at the moment can do that roughly, at least in your personal life. Maybe you and a group of 10 people as part of a startup can do it together. But as you get to larger scales, the structures you need to invoke to produce something that looks like planning and acting end up getting corrupted in many ways. And now you're talking about a global system. And, you have to just realize how far you're going from what we know how to do to what we might hope to eventually do. And then you're asking that system to act now, not later.
I mean, that's true. At the same time, we do have, past example. Like, what is your view on Asilomar and genetic engineering in terms of like how that happened and like whether or not that we can expect that to stick?
So I'm not sure why I want whatever they did. That is, they agreed to something about genetic engineering, but I'm not sure I wanted that. That is, didn't I don't want lots of genetic engineering?
To be clear, I vote no on Asilomar.
Okay.
Right? Like,
okay.
Same as you.
Right.
What I'm asking is, we managed without instituting a rule of government to get a sticky consensus that like we just don't do this. And like we've got pretty much everyone enforcing to not do that.
So I think one of the major changes over the last century, which I think I mentioned earlier in this discussion, is that we've introduced these elite communities. We have a primary identity toward this world elite community and less to their nation, which allows a great convergence of policy opinions around the world. And so it produces less innovation, unfortunately. So we don't do very many local experiments to see if the consensus is actually right, but we actually have a lot of ways in which the whole world does policy roughly the same, even when they, have conflicts in various ways with each other. And so that can work especially strong if there's actually not much industry motive to push something and a lot of strong public opinion, then it's relatively easy to shut down. I would think that is genetic engineering. That is, there wasn't actually that much public demand for genetic engineering. And there's a lot of public disapproval. So if the regulators everywhere agree, then they can
to be clear, I have a remarkably large amount of demand, right? Like for genetic engineering, but I agree that not that many other people necessarily put that much money towards it. But also like we've seen examples where like there clearly was a very large amount of demand and a large amount of economic value, and everyone just sort of left it on the sidelines. Certainly my experience of COVID said these elites were able to enforce dramatically destructive rules pretty much everywhere in ways they clearly should not have done for no good reason.
Right. So, the question is, could one nation be smart enough to defy world convention on a bunch of regulation areas and then get a big advantage relative to the rest of the world, relative also to the boycotts and other punishments that will be invoked on it by the rest of the world for defying it in that way? And it seems like so far, nobody's really shown that they can do a win that way.
Yeah.
Like Iran violates a bunch more international conventions than most places do, but it also gets a bunch of sanctions because of that, and it seems to be not winning on average.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of how much time can you buy, through what level of enforcement in order to try and figure out a better solution, without having to go to such extremes in the actual world government. And I agree these problems are hard, but certainly I think this one's really important, and I'm going to bite this one bullet while pushing back against all the other bullets. And I understand that, is it a reasonable position to just say that it's more important to push back against the other bullets? So one of my positions actually is that we are going to make relatively stupid decisions about how to design and deploy these initial AGIs because of our other stupid decisions about not doing the other things.
Yep.
And that if our world was being smarter about putting people in a world that was prospering in other ways and let them envision positive futures in other ways, and let them feel like they had hope and not under all this pressure and had more dream in their dream time, that they would act more towards ensuring better futures and at least better legacies, and using more caution, and I'd be less scared about what's likely to result from this development. Whereas sort of I see ours as being maximally low dignity in terms of how we're going to do this. A bunch of open source people are going to look to scaffold onto a maximally stupidly designed set of intelligences as quickly as possible. And many major corporations are going to deploy them in ways that are not thinking about the questions that we're thinking about at all.
Right.
And I think there's a substantial difference between what happens there and what happens, if we do these things reflectively, even if we don't do that great a job at figuring out how to direct them. And also there's a possibility that they get directed towards something random, right? These things are sort of all of these discussions we've been having in some important sense, I feel are assuming that these AIs do something vaguely normal-ish, and that is vaguely aligned-ish, and we managed to initially imbue them with broadly human values.
Right. And I think that's very reasonable. That is, I am pretty confident that over the next few years, we will mainly see AIs who are well monitored and tested by their owners, whose behavior in customer environments don't substantially deviate from customer and manufacturer expectations, so that they evolve with respect to those economic pressures for a while. That'll happen for quite a while.
So one of the things that you said a bunch of times in your discussion of Katja was sort of the best way to get X is to get X behavior is just inherently be X under the under the surface. That the mask is easy. It's easier to be the thing inside than to put on the mask, in some sense, right? For a lot of these,
when they're stupid, and very well monitored and tested. That is,
when they're stupid,
it's going to be a long time for if they know whether they're being tested or not. To have an AI that can tell, oh, I'm being tested now, that's going to be quite an achievement. And there's a lot of ways to overcome that. It has to get past a lot of barriers of deception, even, that we can put in to let it not know if it's being tested. So
well, sure. So I feel it's inherent in the architecture of how the human brain happens to work after all that evolution, that in many cases, the most efficient way for a human to exhibit behavior X is to modify the human's inherent tendencies and habits and virtues such that they just naturally favor X. But if you have a computer architecture that's being trained on reinforcement learning and on deep learning, I don't see any particular reason that has to be true. As in the computer learns that it's supposed to exhibit behavior X.
Yeah.
And all it just does is it knows when someone asks X question mark, it says X. Right.
Well, that's the difference between asking and doing. But later on, when you actually train them to do things, then that'll be the doing training, right? So they can already use the chat thing to ask it, what should I do next in this operation? And they just do it. Well, now it's doing. And if you train it in that context, then it's trained on doing.
Yeah. And then, but expecting this to sort of generalize in the way that it would generalize for a human, I think is wrong, right? Like,
Well, it's not just humans. This is how we deal with animals when we train animals, domesticate
but
animals. So it's
animals have the same brain configuration styles we have.
probably happens when you train an octopus. They have a pretty different brain.
I don't know how, okay, I just don't know anything about octopuses. I can't speak to your statement at all.
They're the most different brains on the planet.
I'm just gonna tap out. I just literally don't know anything.
Okay.
Not gonna like wildly speculate about it.
Okay, but surely, like, if you look at actual behavior, right? As long as you're, if you're fielding something that does route planning to the airport or something, you can just check, do the routes go to the airport? How do they compare to other routes? You can just, if it gets out of line, you'll see that in the routes won't go to the airport anymore. They won't go in a short route. If you have a task you have an AI to do, then you can just see whether it's sufficiently aligned in whether it does the task.
So you think that that kind of testing is sufficient to know if, like, under real world conditions?
Well, if you test under real world conditions, yeah, that's the key point. Like, computers in our world are the most commonly tested and monitored products and services of all because it's so easy to test and monitor them. So we max that out in that industry. When you use some computer tool on your laptop, they try to get data right from every time you use it, sending to their database, looking at every use to check whether it's doing what they want it to do in every use. So if you make a thing and then, like, you have to, you put it on a spaceship and it goes years out and then it has to make decisions that nobody ever sees. Well, now, you have to ask if you tested it right enough. But if you're making a thing that people are using constantly and you're watching those uses constantly, then in that context, I'm pretty confident that, yeah, if it's working, it's working. And if it stops working, you'll see. The question is just how far away from that will things get? So, for example, people will be tempted to not just make AIs be at low-level jobs in companies. They'll tend to move up the hierarchy in more management jobs, or maybe even key project choice jobs, investment choice. Now, those are things where the lag is much longer, right? You do a thing and it takes years to find out if it was a good choice. So that's more where there's scope for how do you know if it's making a good choice when it takes so long to check? Of course, we have that problem with humans today, and we do really badly at that. That is, we actually
badly, don't we? Yeah. But
okay,
like,
so we're already in that situation where doctors, lawyers, everybody else, they already go.
And we do especially badly when, like, we don't have the expertise to, like, independently evaluate or understand the choices and plans that are being made when we are inherently less intelligent than the agents we're trying to control. Like, if we hire someone smarter than you, do something you know nothing about,
right?
It's like they can just bullshit you and there's nothing you can do about it. Like, this is well known.
Well, that's why you have to, like, check their performance in key ways. So you have some performance metrics. Don't just listen to their words. That's a recipe for disaster.
In many cases, like, we've figured out the metrics are actually remarkably easy to game. And like,
okay, but this is the world that you're living in and enjoying. So if the AIs do that badly as well as the humans do, that's still a good world. So the humans are already badly aligned here, and we still survive in our world today, right? It's still an okay world. So the worse our current world is, the better the future AI world is going to be, because it can't be that much worse, right?
Oh boy.
I mean, this is the optimism of realizing you're in a messed up world. You go, well, look, we have all this room to go up and less room to go down because it's already bad.
Right. So, like,
you go to the hospital and they don't actually make you any healthier on average. You heard that? So, like, how much worse can the AIs be at that?
One of the great things about having a conversation with you is that we can skip all the things where we just agree and we can move on to the other stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of that. But so, I don't think that, when the AI is put in a situation where, you've taught it to predict what the humans will reward and do that thing, right? That is inherently what our systems do, right? Well, if it's smarter than us and we start giving it complex tasks, it will start doing what it predicts we will reward, not the thing that we told it to do.
That's what our professionals already do for us. Our doctors and our lawyers and our investment managers and our management consultants, that's already what they're doing to
And
us
that's
right
where all
now.
my wealth keeps going, regardless of whether I try to find
But here's the optimism. So in fact, here's a virtue of capitalism, right? When you trusted your cobbler and your baker and your butcher, you didn't check on them so much and they cheated you. When you thought they were dirty capitalists, you watched out for whether they were cheating you and you made them compete with each other and you got better service. So when we distrust the AIs even more than we do the capitalists, we'll actually check whether our AI doctor helps. That will be the positive of our so distrusting the AIs, is that we will actually look at stats about whether they're helping.
And the moment we start looking at stats, all they will care about is those stats.
It'll still be better than the status quo, where we're not even looking.
Well, I mean, the status quo is kind of, I think in the status quo, like people are like definitely adhering to these things in many ways far more than they should in some like strategic sense.
Yeah.
And like less in other senses. Like they also have natures where like humans have to like execute adaptations rather than like deploy very precise strategies in terms of how our architectures actually work, such that like if you are cheating, like basically my experience, like if someone is going to lie to you about something big, right? They're not going to like save all their lies for when it really counts, right? When it's worth like millions and billions of dollars.
No, they lie to you all the time if they do.
They lie to you all the time. And like
you can check if you,
right, whereas,
people rarely do, but they can.
Right. Whereas if AI is like, it's very plausible that like they'll be like value of lying and giving the game away. Not high enough. No, tell truth. Like, and they'll keep doing that over and over again. And then you put them in charge of the big project and they're like, oh,
right.
Interesting. It's like,
okay, but notice that we have these super intelligences in our world, large corporations, and they are much more reliable at looking for opportunities to exploit to make profits, like banks who give higher fees or whatever. And this is the world we're living in. We have these super intelligences who are seeking to exploit us as much as they can. And nevertheless, because we don't trust them so much, they're the damn capitalists, we make them compete.
I mean, I see these
in the better world.
I see these as fundamentally not the same type of thing. I agree that they have, superhuman capabilities in certain specific ways. They're dumber in other specific ways. And like, they're very limited by human cognitive abilities in many ways.
But those don't limit this purpose. A firm, if it can identify a strategy that will make a profit, it will just do it, whether or not that's good for the world or customers in general.
I wish that was truer. I think it's like in practice not as true as I'd like.
If they could identify a strategy and they needed to hire a human and they needed that human to do a distasteful thing, they could pay enough to get a human to do it.
Doesn't mean they will. But I'm just saying that in my observations of actual corporations, both that I've been a part of and that I've observed, like they definitely seem to leave a lot of value on the table pretty often for various reasons. And like,
but they're temporary small values as opposed to big consistent values.
I am of the model that like modern corporations are mostly run by management for management, not by management for shareholders. But like you can, we can have that made separately, but sort of, I guess it all boils down to, you think that what we talk about is the alignment problem of being able to like get these things to have, pretty close to human values and care about humanish things initially, in that sense, is pretty easy. But getting them to preserve this over time is actually just impossible, right?
Yeah, right. Basically, that. So it'll be relatively easy to make them act like us because they won't know how to fool us, and that will just be the easy thing to do, and we'll just be monitoring and testing them. But once they take over a larger fraction of the economy and they have their own wealth, then what they spend that on and use it for will be things that they decide later that aren't what we told them.
So basically, right. So you think that like getting like as good as we can expect alignment will be easy. Getting the kind of alignment that like some of us might want is like just not going to happen ever.
Right.
So why even try? So
well, basically, not at any acceptable cost.
Right. So the returns to trying to align them more go to zero very, very quickly, or negative very, very quickly.
I mean, I think it would be comparable. Imagine you're competing with a grabby alien civilization who has vast supercomputers, but humans make all the important decisions. And you go, well, that's not going to work very well, unless they just really trust all these AIs. But knowing how arrogant humans are, the humans aren't going to just do all what the AI said. They're going to have their own opinions. They're going to screw it up sometimes. But
we can definitely play sci-fi scenarios, and like I am not that opposed to doing so. It's fun, but like, so potentially to get to where you are, right? Like the things that sort of lead there, where like they feel like cruxes, where like if I didn't believe this, I wouldn't have your position. I think even if I shared most of the rest of your model, are one, this type of alignment like is just going to happen. Like the pretty good alignment more or less happens by default, where there's like some important amount of legacy like and value there inherently. Two, that like being able to lock in substantially more than we could get sort of in this initial happy accident is extremely difficult, right?
And there's the third element of, say we fail, I don't care so much because they're my descendants. And just like you might not mind your grandchildren betraying your instructions to them and doing something different with the property they inherited from you, they're inheriting our civilization from us. And the more you identify with them, the more you still just want them to have freedom and powers to do what they want.
So when I think about like a literal grandchild, right? Like squandering the fortune I left him and doing something that I wouldn't have wanted him to do, I noticed that there's a broad range of, well, I'm sad that you did that. And there's actively like, no, I wish you'd never been born and I burned my legacy in a fire, right? Like you can definitely go negative here. Like this guy can turn evil, but like, it's more okay.
If you lose your legacy to kill 1,000 people, like in some mass murder, then you could easily decide that you regret it.
So like, what would be in your mind like a world where we built AI? Like, how bad would it have to be vaguely before you're like, this is what happened, and like you're pretty sad, like you wish we hadn't done that?
Well, I mean, I can say it's not quite the direct answer, but saying, if I would have preferred that we just live for another X years and then went extinct over whatever they did, right? That's the kind of thing we're talking about, right? Where it just
So like, I'm like, how what is the like most plausible version of that you can imagine for like an AI scenario, right? Like, so like obviously like if you imagine like the famous paper clipper, right? Like that's like pretty bad. Like I'd rather just survive for a while than like I actively rather the thing didn't grab the rest of the paperclip. I'd rather the other grab the aliens get it, right? Because that's just so bad. That's so dumb. Like at least that's my opinion. I don't know if that's yours, but
I mean, I just find it very hard to make these value judgments, and so I know many people feel like they can do them easily and then they change them fast, but these seem very hard. And so that's why I struggle to find a basis to make them.
Clearly you've made some very like unpopular, strong value judgments, right? Like about what you like.
I make judgments about what analysis seems promising and interesting. So those are my main public value judgments. And I say, a topic seems worth exploring, I'm going to explore it, and it seems insightful that I want to tell people about it. Those are my main, in some sense, if they learn everything that's worth learning, and then it turned out that wasn't so hard, anybody could have learned it with a little more effort. I mean, my whole effort to be an insightful person to understand things could turn out to be a waste, because turns out it was easy. Once you're at a big enough scale, it's all really easy and you can just figure it all out. And there wasn't any point in putting all this work this far in advance. Why bother?
I would say there was anyway, right? Like that's just part of my value judgment.
Okay.
I just feel that way. I'm not defending it. I'm just asserting.
Right, no.
But like, I'm sort of saying the whole, like, I'm trying to just get a sense of your intuition, Punk, because like, there's clearly some point at which there is too little legacy or like interestingness or complexity or whatever it is you value about the artificial intelligences that result, like that you're sad that you did that you'd rather have just had the humans persist for some amount of time.
I mean, certainly, like, if contrary to my expectations, there just almost is no complexity, right? There's just vast uniformity going off into the horizon, and that would be pretty disappointing. I mean, because that's what I see the current universe looks like that to me, right? It's this vast uniformity, and I'm hoping for something better, right?
Like, I claim this in the name of AI doesn't really like make me feel like that planet is put to better use, right? Like, who cares?
Right, but if they make something complicated out of it, with a lot of intricate parts doing different things. And then that looks interesting.
Then it's interesting, and maybe it's worth something. I don't know. Like I have to, depends.
Right.
But yeah. Right. But like it's sort of what's weird about these types of the conversation, right, that I'm having with you and that you had with Katya and so on, is that all the things that I am trying to convince other people to believe in most of my other conversations, I think you actually mostly believe quite a few of them, like almost
Right.
all of them.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And if they were convinced of your positions on what was likely to happen physically based on our choices, like, they would overwhelmingly become more skeptical of artificial intelligence, right? Like if you showed them these features.
Well, because I just have this position that most people, if they understood how strange the future was likely to get, would just generically veto all change. So this is an instance of that. That's not a particularly
you're confident-
admirable instance, but yeah, it's an instance.
And like you're confident they're wrong. And
I know I want to bet against them. That's not quite the same as feeling confident, but at some point you have to make a bet. So I'm going to make the bet there. Right. I mean, in some sense, had our ancestors made that same choice, we wouldn't be here, right? We are here because our ancestors didn't know how strange things would get and didn't coordinate to prevent it.
you'd almost argue that like, no, we're here because our ancestors didn't. I mean, but they didn't have that option until very recently, right? Like there's no plausible world in which our ancestors could have prevented change until pretty recently.
I think foragers didn't like farming, and they often tried to coordinate pretty hard to prevent it, and they succeeded for pretty long durations, but not long enough.
Yeah, but you're not going to succeed everywhere all the time forever. At some point,
Right.
Because it's never in your individual interest to like be absolutely damn sure there are no farmers. So you have other things to do.
Right. And so at the moment, we seem to have this possibility of global governance or global coordination. And it seems to allow us to do more things than our ancestors did, to give us more options about how to control the future. I worry that that's a bit deceptive because you don't see just how floppy and random is this tool you think you can use and how many costs you have from trying to use it. That's
Yeah. And I think it's true that most people don't appreciate what the cost of that thing would be and already use their existing tools way too much on a variety of ways.
right.
And we both wish they would stop. But at the same time, there are specific places where, I'm very, very glad we use the tools we use in the ways that we use them. And other places. So,
I mean, as you may know, I favor policy that's robust to these uncertainties we're discussing. So I have a proposal for FUM liability, for example, to discourage things that get close to FUM under the scenario that would discourage FUM. And even if I'm less worried than others, I don't think my opinion should dominate this policy choices. We should look for robust policies. So then I might say, what's a robust policy here with respect to these concerns? And so I'm open to hearing robust policies. I want to hear a policy that if it's one way, it goes well. If it's the other way, it goes well. So, only a modest cost in both situations. And I like that.
I think that FUM liability is better than not FUM liability, right? Like it's you're taking a portion of the externality that's being caused, and you are forcing them to overlay it onto someone else, and that's good.
Right.
But what portion of the harm done by FUM is done by aborted FUMs that
sure, but comparing a policy to some imagined perfect policy is somewhat beside the point because you could also
in theory you could say only a very so you could say if Robin Hanson is right if it's true that like FUM is basically just impossible, then getting that close to FUM should also be very unlikely.
In which case the policy doesn't cost much.
Right.
Almost never implemented. Yeah.
But regardless of the risk level of FUM, like 99% of the actual costs in terms of future value of FUMs and aborted FUMs is in the actual FUM, even if 99% of FUMs are aborted.
Sure, but in terms of optimal avoidance, you'll still get a lot of good avoidance because people won't want to get anywhere near that.
what I'm suggesting is like, what if we multiply this policy by a lot, right? Like just
Well,
like,
I don't know if you recall, there was some constants available in the description of the policy, numbers to be argued over, right? So you could
Yeah.
just multiply it a lot by turning those numbers. It's part of the policy is it has some numbers that haven't been specified.
yes, that you have to be, right, there's like and then multiply it by several zeros.
Okay, so that, I'm just guessing if we have politicians discuss that, they will negotiate some number there, and it won't be your favorite number, but it might be the best you can get.
So basically, if you wanted to limit things, I think if I bought your general model of what would happen in terms of how aligned things would be by default, and I also bought that fervor alignment was impossible, right? Then you have to make a choice. You either say yes or no to this scenario, right? They basically, I think your premise does imply the conclusion that we have to make this choice. And the question is, do we say yes or do we say no? And if we say yes, then, well, I notice that like I am confused why we have so little influence over the nature of the thing that we endow. Like, will we just always have like some vaguely human values, like weird air quotes label, or like will it be like depending on, like do you think that like it'd be a substantial difference depending on who built
But
these AIs?
you should be similarly confused about your influence over your children 8 generations out. You should notice you don't have much influence, and you should be similarly confused there.
I agree. I don't have as much influence as I'd like. I do think that, I do have I feel like I have more influence over that, or rather, I feel like I can make predictions that I like more about what they'll look like, if anything else, if nothing else. Like I'm not,
I think you got to accept they could be really different. Because if you looked at how much we've changed in the last, say, 3 centuries, even, we've done a lot of pretty big changes.
So like, how far back would you have to go in terms of when a human existed before that human was as different from a average human today, the average human back then to average human today, as the average human today is to GPT?
Well, maybe a bit before a chimp.
Okay, so at that pace, I'm willing to take my chances, right, with my generations. I guess I'll just put it that way, right? And they'll be different, and that's gonna have to be okay.
Well, I think we've had a great conversation, and we understand each other better and made some progress. So I thank you for having the conversation, Zvi.
Absolutely, I think it's a great place to wrap up. So, all right.
All right, until we meet again.
Absolutely.